Buthelezi, co-chair from the National Assembly. As we're gonna start this meeting, I wish to greet greet the co-chair and all members of both houses, stakeholders, participants and the support staff, media and public. Members, the objective of today's meeting, before we go to the agenda, the objective of today is, the main objective of today's joint meeting of appropriations is to receive submissions and the presentation from the PBO. That is the main objective of today's meeting. And before we go to the agenda for today, we will have apologies, and then we will have the objective of today is from COSATU, the main objective of today's joint meeting from appropriations, and Equal Education Section 27 is to receive joint submission and Equal Education Law presentation from the PBO. Then we will have today's meeting deliberations. And before we go to the agenda for today, can we start with the first point of the agenda, which is have apologies? Any apologies to Babalo? Have the objective of today is from COSATU, the main objective of today's joint meeting from outside.
From the select apology,
we have two apologies.
Can we start with the point of the agenda, which is apology? Before we go to apology, let me just explain what the apology is. Honorable Masango, can we start with the agenda, which is in terms of preparations of the funeral of her grandmother. And Honorable Molotane, I learned that he is being hospitalized, and that we will wish him a speedy recovery. Then Chairperson on the NA side, any apologies?
Chairperson, I haven't received any apologies, Co-Chairperson.
Thank you.
Yes,
okay, Honorable Buthelezi.
Okay.
Yes, Honorable Matafa may join us late, and Honorable Dikhalo is just struggling with her connectivity, but she'll also be joining. But Chairperson, I would also like to make a proposal about the agenda, if you may allow me to.
Perfect, Chair, no problem. You may continue.
Can I propose that we deal with all the presentations, including the presentation from PBO, before we deliberate? So, if we were to take number 7 to number 6 and number 6 to number 7, that's one proposal, so that when we take discussions, we can interact with all the presentations. And lastly, Chair, agenda item number 9 is not a joint committee item. So after the deliberations, it will be a closer for the joint session, and then FOA will continue with agenda number 9.
Thank you very much, Honorable Buthelezi. I think it's perfect because that will also save us time to give the NA enough time in which this is a 3-hour meeting. So we would not want the NA to have continue after 12, because it's a 9 to 12 meeting. It's a 3-hour meeting. Everything will be done within the 3 hours. So I think the agenda, if there any from any members, in terms of the agenda arrangement.
I agree, Chairperson Yunus. I agree altogether with Mr. Buthelezi.
Okay, thank you. Perfect. So then we will deal with the submissions and all the presentations, and then after that will be deliberations, and then we'll be closing the joint meeting. Thank you very much. Without wasting any time, I will give over to COSATU to make their deliberation. I think time management will be very important. We have looked at the presentations to give 10 minutes. 10 minutes per presentation, pending on maybe on PBO. We will manage that in terms of time. But if you can try to get our presentations within 10 minutes so that we have enough time for deliberations and also to give time to the NA for the last part of the meeting. Can we give to COSATU?
Okay, thank you, Chair. Good morning, members. Thank you for giving time for COSATU. Yes, we'll try to make our presentation to the point to help with the time management. So we can just go to the next slide, Lubabalo. Chair, look, I think on the Adjustment Appropriations Bill, and we understand the fiscal pressures the government is facing, which are massive. We had expected them to reinforce the key departments on the front line against COVID-19. We welcome where those readjustments have been done. We are also expecting government to reinforce the key departments on the front line to save jobs in the economy. What we've seen there are cuts, which we are deeply opposed to. We had also hoped, Chair, to see more intervention plans from government to save key departments, municipalities, SOEs. We didn't see that. We also didn't see detailed plans on how are they going to address corruption, wasteful expenditure in the different departments, or even to recapacitate a very fragile state. Chair, next slide. Chair, we had really hoped to see a 1 trillion rand stimulus plan. We didn't see significant effort in that regard. There was some reference to the infrastructure program, but not enough detail, and some contradictions have been put there. We really hope to see in the different allocation to the departments more economic and regulatory interventions. We hadn't seen that. We saw very little job retention and creation interventions and very little reference to local procurement. Next slide. Chair, on the wage bill, I won't go into too much on it, but just to say in the Adjustment Appropriations Bill, there's a prohibition on any savings in the departments being used to address the wage bill problems. And Chair, we think that's a problem. We can't encourage government departments to save money and then say no, but you can't use it to assist with the wage bill issue, when for many departments the most critical tool is the teachers, it's the nurses, it's the police officers. Chair, we think there is better ways for government to address the wage bill pressures, and that should be simply looking at the next 3-year agreement. And one of the major interventions that's helping government now is how inflation has plummeted from the 5.5% government had budgeted for to now about 2% and likely to go down further. But Chair, we really think on the wage bill, if you expect nurses and teachers and police officers and prison wardens to risk their lives, we should have the courtesy to honor the inflation increases. Next slide. Chair, we do agree with government about a need for a credible plan to reduce the debt, but we feel they are putting the cart before the horse. For us, the key thing is to stimulate growth, to capacitate the state, and that will increase revenue, not simply to cut before growth happens. Chair, we really feel government is far too soft on the issue of corruption, wasteful expenditure. It does have the powers under the Auditing Amendment Act, which we have not seen government utilizing. We feel there's not enough political accountability for office bearers who misbehave or for the departments which fail. And again, the NPA and the SAP's lack of intervention is very worrying. There's very little lifestyle forensic audits, and the Chief Procurement Office role has really been quite diminished over the past few years. Next slide. Yeah, next slide. Next slide, Lubavalo.
Okay, you can continue while we are waiting for the slide.
Okay, let me continue.
Yes.
So, Chair, some other concerns we have around the overall on the budget was a lack of clarity around what is the impact of the reprioritization. Is it simply about reducing frivolous and wasteful expenditure, which will be welcome, or what will be the impact of the infrastructure rollout delays, or the impact of not filling badly needed posts? And that's critical to know if we can have permanent reductions in that regard, or are these really just austerity cuts? Chair, we don't need to look far to find where the body's buried. The Auditor General's findings every year are a horror story. Yet there's very little on the Appropriations Adjustment Bill, which speaks to what are the interventions that different departments are doing to address the serious allegations of corruption, wasteful expenditure, and so forth. We saw the Minister of Human Settlements speaking to 30 billion rand worth of irregular expenditure in the Department of Water and Sanitation. But we're not seeing what are the plans to deal with this crisis, Chair. Chair, around basic education, I think we all now see the consequence of a failure to invest in school infrastructure over many years, especially sanitation. This has now forced the President to announce an additional closure of public schools for 4 weeks, simply because most schools are not ready to deal with COVID-19 and to make sure learners and the staff are protected, and of course their families when they go home after school are protected. And this is the consequence of a lack of management in that department, Chair. And the bill doesn't speak to that. Chair, around the additional funding for health, we welcome that, but we are a little bit worried that the reduced allocation for personnel is not helpful when in fact the President correctly said we actually need to have more health workers, especially for the COVID-19 crisis. We also had hoped to see more emphasis on building permanent infrastructure for health facilities as opposed to temporary facilities. Chair, on transport, we had welcomed the additional allocations, but we were quite dumbfounded about a cut in 2.2 billion rand for PRASA and 1.9 billion for public transport. And this is when PRASA is literally on its knees. Chair, we support the additional 1.1 billion taxi relief. Taxi industry needs to be given subsidies. The fact that it's not given subsidies is a huge problem, but it has to be conditional upon the taxi industry becoming compliant with all the tax laws and all the labor laws. The fact that government has allowed itself to be bullied by the industry is a problem in itself. Chair, the reduction of 2.2 billion rand from human settlements and 257 million rand from water sanitation is worrying, and there's a lack of clarity about why has that done and what is the impact upon, in particular, upgrading informal areas. Chair, if you look at Cape Town, the hotspots are all in informal areas, and it's directly linked to the lack of decent sanitation for these long-suffering areas. So we had hoped in higher education a much more decisive shift towards getting learners to be able to learn online, distance learning, providing students with laptops, data, and data-free sites. And the fact is that many universities have not had the resources to roll out laptops. Some of them are just simply selling laptops to students. And this is really going to impede students in historically disadvantaged institutions from being able to learn. Chair, our main gripe with the Appropriations Bill is around the cuts to the economic departments. We welcome the appointment of additional 500 labor inspectors. That's a welcome relief, but actually more is needed. But the cut of 55 million rand from the CCMA when millions of workers are facing retrenchment, when there's massive queues there, is going to compound issues. They should have been reinforced. The cut of 1.7 billion rand from DTI, in particular 1.2 billion from the industrial financing, is going to decimate manufacturing industries. It will cost us jobs in the industrial sector. It should be reversed. Equally, Chair, when rural areas are struggling with electrification, cutting 1.5 billion from the electrification program to us, it doesn't make sense. Small business development says they need about 11 billion rand to give relief to SMMEs, yet we've cut their budget by 67 million. Chair, the retail sector, the restaurants, tourism industry is one of the largest employers in the country. The tourism sector is going to take the longest time to recover, yet we're cutting 1 billion rand from the Department of Tourism. Agriculture, Chair, is the largest employer outside of the state, and we really had hoped to see more significant sectoral support, especially for emerging farmers. We've all talked about fast-tracking the rollout of the digital economy and digital learning, yet we have not seen a reinforcement of this department or plan from them to get things moving. On the security frontline departments, Chair, the President was very bold in the SONA by pledging 7,000 new police posts. Yet the budget cut 7,000 police posts, and we're now compounded with 10,000 police officers having been infected with COVID-19. We had hoped to see a reinforcement of correctional services where a large number of prison warders are being infected. And of course, given the nature of our prisons, those are the next pandemic outbreak sites. Chair, we've all seen what's happened at the State Capture Commission, yet there's silence on what has been done to clean up State Security Agency and with regards to the allegations of huge corruption there. Chair, workers, if they don't win in the CCMA or if the employer appeals the ruling, they go to the Labour Court. But it takes on average about 2 years to get a date in the Labour Court. And we'd really hope to see some reinforcement in that regard. At Home Affairs Chair, I think we're all aware of the huge queues there, but we'd also hope to see a shifting of services to go online to Home Affairs in a much faster speed, and also a beginning of a discussion about the options of having a single elections for the country, especially as we're approaching local elections next year. Chair, I know Honourable Karim would ask me that these are all fine proposals, but where will you get the money? Money can't be printed. Chair, we think the options to find additional revenue are around further reprioritization of expenditure, but in a sustainable, non-austerity, non-reckless approach, further capacitation of SARS, cracking down on tax evasion, customs enforcement, looking at wealth taxes. We do support government's international financial assistance, but we need to get more clarity around the conditions, especially from the IMF investment. We need to have a frank discussion with the DFIs about how can they help stimulate the economic growth. And Chair, we do support the Minister of Finance proposals to look at reviewing Regulation 28 so we can really impact private sector investment. That is the way to grow the economy. And of course, Chair, we can raise as much revenue as you want, but if you don't deal with the 10% of the budget that we lose to corruption and wasteful expenditure, we will never come right. The last thing, Comrade Chair, and I would want to thank the Appropriations Committee yesterday for the engagement with the Minister of Finance around the delays to the 200 billion rand credit guarantee scheme. I think we would welcome Treasury's interventions and its report. Our question, though, is that enough? If we've only dispersed about 5.5%, 11 billion rand of the 200 billion rand to date, is this intervention going to make a sufficient disbursement? Chair, we think there are further interventions needed, looking at how you can make these applications online, reduce the turnaround time frame, relax the credit requirements, also what the money can be used for, look at incentives, and also look at reducing the interest rates being charged. Chair, we would want to say as COSATU that we think this is such a critical issue. It's 40% of the stimulus or the economic relief package, rather. The fact that only 5% has been released so far is a massive national crisis. So we would like to suggest to the Chair and to the honourable members that it would be useful if the committees could call the banks and Treasury to a special meeting to discuss this and to receive monthly reports from the Treasury about how is this being dealt with and how is it being fast-tracked. But I think this is such a critical issue to saving the economy and just literally saving millions of workers' jobs. So let me stop there, Chair. I hope I've kept to your time frame. Thank you.
Thank you very much, COSATU. It was well done in very good time management. I believe that I did not push you, but you have done very well. Thank you very much. Then we'll get a second presentation. This will be from Outer.
Honorable Chair. Honorable Chair.
Yes, Honorable Co-Chair.
Yes, they are requesting that we switch our videos on.
Okay, thank you. Okay, can we please switch our videos on?
Can I start, Chair?
Yes, you may start.
Thank you very much, and good morning to all the honourable members. I'm going to be as quick as possible and very much to the point. Next slide, please. So, Chair, just to say, this is how the presentation is structured. These are the themes that we're dealing with. I'll get right into it. Next slide, please. So the essence of the message we want to send today, Chairperson and members, is that we simply don't have money to waste. I would like to continue the engagement that was quite heated before with the committees on finance regarding the ideology, or at least the philosophy that's being used to respond to this crisis. And we do very much support National Treasury's decision to cap the amount of money that we can spend as a country in light of the fact that we are spending more money on debt servicing costs and these kinds of incidental costs as opposed to social development and infrastructure spending. That's really the basis of this. So we are in a recession. We are now seeing stark problems coming to the fore as a result of COVID-19 And we want to focus on misspending, Chairperson, and that's really the issue that we think needs to be addressed urgently. The Adjustment Appropriation Bill in its current form, we do not support, and I'm going to get to the reasons why, but to say that we do not support this committee adopting this bill in its current form. We want to see significant improvements in accountability for the expenditure of these funds, Chairperson, and that's really the essence of what I'm saying here today. Next slide, please. We welcome zero-based budgeting, Chairperson. We believe it has to be implemented at every level of government. We really need to see very clear roles on how this is going to be done, and we need to see clear buy-in from all parts of government. We believe that Parliament should play a central role in ensuring that that happens, to ensure improved intergovernmental fiscal relations and to ensure that municipalities and provinces also really conform to this principle. Next slide, please. We believe the key to be able to do this is transparency. Members, there's a very strong emphasis in what's going to happen in October in the MTBPS, and what's happening at the moment is consistently labeled as interim measures, and the real reform measures that we have been advocating for and that a lot of people in this country are really expecting at the moment are set to come in October. And we would like to see, as the public, how that unfolds and how these decisions are taken. I'll get to reprioritization in a moment, but we don't understand how these decisions are taken, especially in such short time frames. We make this presentation in good faith. Chairperson, we must believe that the input that you receive here can have an effect and that this committee's discretion actually can make a difference. We must believe that if there is no agreement here that the decisions that have been taken on reprioritization are correct, that can be changed. Next slide, please. So getting to reprioritization, Chair, and we all really adults in this engagement, and we are all, well, you are all seasoned politicians. So I'll be blunt to say that the only kind of state in history where social development, infrastructure, education, and these kinds of expenditures are deprioritized as opposed to police and defense are military dictatorships, Chairperson. And that is not the kind of country that we would like in South Africa. I'm sure we can all agree on that. We used an example in this exercise focused on the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy, and we've published our thinking on this, and it's caused quite a stir. We realized that there is a deprioritization of the electrification program, and that entities such as Nexa that have been performing extremely poorly over the past few years do not see any cuts, while a really key multiplier like electrification is sacrificed. We believe that should be rejected. Honorable members, we would like to suggest that, and I'll move on to the next slide, please. We would like to suggest that a rejection of the increases to the Departments of Defense and Police, at least partially, that equates to the proposed cut to the electrification program, should be used to continue funding electrification, especially in the situation we are in today, where people are forced to stay at home, and there are people who do not have electricity and warmth in their homes. We refer to the Department of Water and Sanitation as well. As the previous speaker said, Chairperson, there has been gross misspending, there's been gross corruption and consistent wasteful expenditure, and the adjustment to these allocations, we don't see them. We don't see significant cuts to the departments and the entities that perform poorly every year, and we don't believe that that is acceptable. We would also like to see a final decision in Cabinet to deal with the matter of e-tolls, which has been an ongoing saga. Ad hoc appropriations to this entity are now the last resort, something that could have been avoided if funds were allocated to this program from the start, as we have been advocating. Again, we recommend that the Departments of Police and Defense do not receive additional allocations, but that they actually do what they need to do in light of COVID-19 with their original appropriations. That some of those extra allocations rather go to departments that are really essential for development and social well-being. Next slide, please. Compensation, Chair, we believe that the government wage bill is unaffordable. We do not think that compensation and debt service costs can be the core and the majority of spending in government. We simply do not have enough money to spend most of what we have on debt servicing costs and paying people for services. So the public service, Chair, we all know that it's not always in good quality. We know that even though money is spent on salaries, there isn't necessarily performance, that salaries are not adjusted according to performance of departments as wholes, but also to individuals. These wage bills and the compensation in total is appropriated regardless of performance outcomes and regardless of the service on the ground. We do not believe that that is sustainable. Next slide, please. Public entities, Chair, refer to that as opposed to SOEs because even though Denel, Eskom, and these major SOEs are really the core problem and a major fiscal risk, there are many entities that we believe have become redundant. In the previous engagement with this committee, Chair, we were asked to provide a list of the entities that we believe are redundant. We simply don't have the capacity to do that, I'm afraid to say, Chair. But there are advisory bodies in government like the FFC that I'm sure would be very happy to do that exercise if they were requested to do so by this committee. In general, Chair, we very much support SOE reforms. We believe that it's extremely necessary. We agree with the Minister of Finance in that regard. And we strongly agree with the National Planning Commission's position paper on this. And we suggest that this committee also applies its mind to that position paper. Next slide, please. Local government, Chairperson, is a serious issue. We see this in every engagement, every public hearing. There is strong focus on this issue, but solutions are not forthcoming. We believe that this needs to be dealt with very seriously and very urgently. And we would like to welcome the President's speech last night where he emphasized that people deserve accountability, that taxpayers and ratepayers really deserve to see services for the money that they spend, and for the fact that they vote this government into power. It needs to provide solutions to the crisis we're seeing in local government. We think that it has to be a collaborative effort, that everyone must come to the table, and that the likes of SALGA must be cooperative when it comes to these kinds of solutions, and that they must very much be willing to compromise. Next slide, please. Chair, monthly accounting, we believe, is really an essential tool to be able to do this. We've been engaging with the Auditor General's office, and there's just a lack of transparency in how money is spent. The additional allocation specifically for COVID-19 related purposes, we need to use this as an example, as the beginning of a new precedent that municipalities really account in real time for the money that they spend. Next slide, please. Chair, we are very concerned, as I said before, that money is cut from departments like education, that serious infrastructure grants are being sacrificed. There is support for business, specifically in light of COVID-19, but this is at the expense of existing support packages and programs that are now being sacrificed very silently, and we believe this has to be interrogated very carefully. Next slide, please. So this is the summary of our recommendations, Chair. We believe that zero-based budgeting must be implemented very, very strongly, very aggressively, without compromise, without exception. We do not believe that programs that haven't achieved their purpose must be sustained and they should be eliminated. We believe there must be much more transparency in all forms of expenditure, and we need to see transparency in how the budget is put together, specifically in the run-up to October. And Chair, we suggest that this committee recommends exactly that to National Treasury. Local government, we need to see clear plans and reporting for how this extra money is spent, but how ordinary allocations are spent. As we've seen in the local government audit reports, it is extremely bleak, and we can't accept this. Next slide, please. Coming toward the end, we need to demand fiscal discipline, Chair, in all organs of state. Now more than ever, we simply do not have money to waste. And we also recommend that this committee rejects the additional appropriations to the Departments of Defense and Police, and rather ensure that electrification is sustained. We recommend that essential spending is not cut, that especially when it comes to infrastructure expenditure, as the FFC has also been saying, that this simply cannot be sacrificed. We cannot afford that. And finally, we believe that SOEs and all public entities that receive extra appropriations, but their ordinary allocations as well, this must be held to very strict conditions with consequences if those conditions are not met. We believe this committee can play a central role in that, cooperating with the Portfolio Committee on Public Enterprises. Last slide, please. Chair, we want to emphasize that this is Parliament's final say, and Parliament really has the authority to approve this budget. As we've said, we believe it must not be adopted in its current form, but once it is adopted in whatever form, Parliament is ultimately responsible for how this money is spent, even though it is also liable at the levels of provincial and local government. Next slide. Thank you. That's it, Chair.
Thank you very much to Outa. Thank you very much for time very well managed. Thank you very much. Then we'll go to the next presentation or submission which will be a joint submission from Equal Education Section 27 and Equal Education Law Center. We then thank you very much. You can consider.
Thank you. I just would like to say good morning to everyone and thank you to the Chair, Deputy Chair and Honourable members for allowing us to present. I will be presenting along with Daniel McLaren on behalf of Equal Education Section 27 and Equal Education Law Centre. My name is Jane Borman. I'm a parliamentary researcher at Equal Education. Next slide, please. Just a quick overview. We would like to firstly bring the committee's attention to certain issues in the supplementary budget and the Adjustments Appropriation Bill. We would also like to make suggestions and recommendations to the committee. We are very disheartened by the deprioritization of basic education funding, which has accelerated in the supplementary budget. Daniel will take you through the basic education funding trends prior to COVID-19 and the main takeaways from the 2020 supplementary budget. I will then take you through the issue of why basic education is not deemed to be a frontline department, some issues with transparency and oversight, and lastly, some recommendations. Thank you. Next slide, please.
Okay, thanks, Jane, and good morning, honourable members. It's Daniel McLaren from Section 27. So this slide just gives an overview of the trends that we've seen in basic education funding over the last few years. On the left-hand side, there's a graph just showing the share of non-interest expenditure which is allocated to basic education. So this is all expenditure except for debt service costs. So when you look at this expenditure, you really get an idea of what government's priorities are. And what we've seen before COVID-19, in 2019 in particular, basic education was deprioritized. And then at the start of this year, it was deprioritized further. So it's gone down from about 18.6 of non-interest expenditure in 2018 to about 17.3% at the start of this year. And the COVID-19 supplementary budget deprioritizes basic education further, taking it down to only about 16.8% of non-interest expenditure. There's a similar trend on the right-hand side. If you look at the consolidated nominal increases to the basic education sector, if we go back about 5 years, we can see just above CPI inflation increases. But at the start of this, which was sort of slowing each year, but at the start of this year, the increase to the basic education sector overall was only 1.3% in nominal terms, which is about 3 percentage points below CPI inflation. So this meant that overall, there's less spending available to the sector to spend on schools, on teachers, etc. this year compared to the previous year. And because the DB's budget has been cut further in this adjustments special adjustments budget, that trend again is deepened. So we actually see a real and a nominal decrease in education funding this year. It's important to note that there's research which has been published recently from Stellenbosch University, which shows that if you actually discount education spending by what they call the Basic Education Price Index, so basically if you look at what it actually costs to produce education inputs, especially teachers, in the education sector today, and compare that with 10 years ago, and then you divide the budget per learner, what you'll actually see is a decreasing trend of funding per learner. So we're actually spending less per learner today in real terms than we were about a decade ago. Later on in the presentation, we'll show that infrastructure has been a key area where cuts have been applied. But we just want to raise this as a key point at the moment because education remains an apex priority for government. It remains an immediately realizable right in the Constitution. And it's for those reasons that we find it very difficult to understand why the sector is bearing the brunt of these cuts. And we want the committee to pay close attention to that going forward. If we could have the next slide, please. The next slide shows that an answer from Minister Macheka recently to a question posed in the Basic Education Committee about whether provinces were still able to fund schools, including no-fee schools at minimum per learner levels. And what we can see is, as a result of these declining funding trends in KZN and Mpumalanga and the Northern Cape, the poorest quintile 1 to 3 schools, those are schools which can't supplement government funding with fees, are no longer being funded at the minimum gazetted level per learner. And this is, if we go to the next slide, this is even more troubling in the context where funding is being reduced and schools are being asked to pay for the majority of their COVID-19 related expenditures from within existing budgets. So they already have a budget which is below the minimum threshold, and they're being asked to spend that existing budget rather than being given new funds to cover sanitization, etc. So we think this is going to put extreme pressure on schools. If we go to the next slide, and the slide after that. In Limpopo, for example, schools have been told that they could use up to 45% of their existing budgets to cover COVID-19. We know that it's similar in other provinces. So we're very worried about what will be left in school budgets to pay for everything from maintenance to textbooks to all of the other inputs, electricity, water, etc., in those schools when the budgets are so tight. And just a brief summary of where the other cuts are coming from. So there's a net cut in this adjustments bill of 1.7 billion rand to infrastructure, school infrastructure. The math, science and technology additional support which is provided is cut by 68 million rand. And the HIV AIDS life skills support is cut by 59.6 million rand. And the point that we make in our submission is that these cuts really do affect long-term investments in improving quality basic education. Obviously, infrastructure is a long-term investment, but math, science and technology improving on that front, given how those subjects were dealt with in the past, is a massive priority for equal education. And HIV/AIDS life skills has been a really important intervention for raising awareness about people's behaviors and about how to deal with HIV/AIDS. Raising that at a young age is a really important preventative measure. And we're cutting back on that as well. So that could also have implications further down the line. And then when you're also relying on existing school budgets to pay for the huge adaptation that's required to deal at the school level with this pandemic, we think that this approach also affects the core service delivery requirements of the sector. And we could be looking at some really poor performance at the school level for this school year. Obviously, it's a disrupted year in any case, but the fact that schools aren't getting additional budget support to cope with this pandemic is likely to exacerbate the challenges. Okay, back to Jane.
Thank you. If we could have the next slide, please. If it's possible to have, otherwise I can just keep, okay, great. Thank you very much. If we could go, just to the next slide, please. So we are obviously, sorry, not, my apologies, not, so it would be to the next slide after that. Yes, great. Thank you very much. So the committee is obviously, a lot of people have drawn attention to the issues of cuts to infrastructure. We won't spend too much time on this. We just wanted to obviously highlight the drastic cuts that have been made. There's been a total net cut of, as Daniel said, 1.7 billion. 2.2 billion has been taken from the education infrastructure grant. 600 million of that has gone to the school infrastructure backlog grant, but is for sanitation and COVID-19 relief measures. Furthermore, 4.4 billion has been reprioritized within the education infrastructure grant for COVID-19 relief. It is just worth noting that this is one of the largest grant reprioritizations in the supplementary budget, and we are concerned as to why education infrastructure has deemed to be the grant that is deprioritized the most, considering its key pivotal role in the realization of the basic right to education. Next slide, please. Then just quickly, there's also been cuts to the National School Nutrition Program. There was a 15 million cut and no additional funding received. We would like to emphasize, and we will when we discuss education as a frontline sector, that we're not only disheartened by the cuts, but we're disheartened that there's no additional support provided. Recent studies have shown increased food insecurity and hunger and poverty levels in households. This is while many learners, in fact, most learners, didn't receive their usual meal from the National School Nutrition Program during lockdown. There was a recent court case supported by Equal Education and Section 27, in which the Department of Basic Education was ordered by the North Gauteng High Court. Well, they confirmed that there was a failure to roll out a nutritious meal a day to eligible learners, and that irrespective of whether they are learning or not, they should be receiving these meals. And they said that it was an egregious infringement of children's right to education and basic nutrition. We're obviously very heartened by this judgment, but it now requires the Department of Basic Education to re-implement the program, and we will be monitoring that, and hopefully this committee will be too. Next slide, please. Then we come to the issue of why education has not been deemed a frontline sector. This slide merely highlights that it was not deemed a frontline sector and contrasts that with the South African Defence Force and the SAPS, which were deemed frontline sectors and given additional 6.7 billion rand. We question that prioritization. Next slide, please. We feel that basic education should be a frontline sector. We feel that because currently schools are at the center of community safety since they have been reopening. And we have seen that now with the reclosure of schools due to the fact that without having safe and secure schools, we are putting our communities at risk. And obviously, without being able to secure schools, that means that learners can't return, which jeopardizes their right to basic education. So it is truly key that we are spending the money to ensure that our children can continue to learn and that the communities are safe. Obviously, it's also a means for them to get food provisions through the National School Nutrition Program. And we are worried that a lack of additional funding will jeopardize long-term education. Next slide, please. Then we would just like to make a couple of comments about transparency, participation, and oversight in the budget process. We request that in light of these huge reprioritizations in basic education and the budget in general, that this committee commits themselves to having these trade-offs discussed and debated openly and publicly, that the public has early and unfettered access to information and assumptions. And we ask that with regard to the large infrastructure deprioritization, that the committee's call for revised school infrastructure plans from the Department of Basic Education that stem from a needs-based assessment of the current state of school infrastructure. We really feel that, there needs to be increased scrutiny of the infrastructure plans to ensure that it is just not deemed an easier way to cut funds, but jeopardizes basic education in the long term. Next slide, please. Then lastly, I'll just quickly go through our recommendations. We humbly request that the committee advocate for the basic education sector to be deemed a frontline service in the fight against COVID-19, as we discussed earlier. That the committee advocate for the basic education sector to receive additional funding to support its COVID-19 response, including funding from the fiscal relief package. We request that this committee demand that the minimum per learner funding thresholds are met by provincial and national departments of basic education for the remainder of the 2020 school year, especially in no-fee schools. We ask the committee to ask the National Treasury to implement a system to monitor provincial COVID-19 expenditure. As you know, there's a large provincial discretion in spending COVID-19 funds, and we are concerned that there will be further mismanagement of funds. Next slide, please. And then lastly, we request that this committee consider the need to provide additional funding to the National School Nutrition Program, specifically, obviously, in light of this recent High Court judgment. We request that the committee monitor key decisions in the lead up to the medium-term expenditure framework planning process and discourage further cuts and ensure that people's views on this process are put forward. And lastly, we request that this committee support advocacy calling for improved transparency of rationale, assumptions, and underpinning documents, and advocate for the public participation earlier in the budget process. We thank the committee again for allowing us to present, and we hope that they will consider our submission. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the joint submission of equal education. We're now going to have our last input or last presentation from PBO. And then after that, we will be having deliberations. Can we invite PBO?
Good morning, honourable members. I'm Nelia. I will do the presentation this morning, but all my colleagues are present on the platform and they will also assist with some of the clarity questions from members. So we're on the introduction slide. So members, our office did a technical analysis on the 2020 Adjustments Appropriations Bill that was tabled. And with this supplementary budget, government actually attempts to set out commitments to strengthen public finance and position the economy for faster and inclusive growth, and also address the immediate demands of the COVID-19 pandemic. Regulations was also developed by several departments to limit the spread of the virus. Government also developed policy priorities in terms of how funds will be allocated, and the priorities were for health. 3.7% of all equitable shares were reprioritized, and then additional funding for households, in specific for child support, foster care, and social relief. And initially there was also indication that the old age pensions or support for the older people will be provided. And then also support the revenue, mainly to support the revenue shortfalls due to the limited economic activity. Next slide. I just added this slide, members, just to indicate what the legal requirements are for the appropriations. So the Minister may appropriate unspent funds for compensation of employees to be used within the same vote for transfers and subsidies. The Minister can also use goods and services for compensation of employees in the same vote. The Minister can also approve transfers and subsidies to other institutions that can be used elsewhere within a main division, meaning a program. And then payments for capital assets can be used elsewhere in any main division within the same vote. Next slide. The next slide, members, we're just also trying to give you an synopsis of what is currently happening globally and in the South African economy due to the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. The IMF actually revised the economic growth estimates down from -3 in April to -4.9 in June. Global trade has declined and financial risks have increased. The world is facing a human development crisis in 2020, and it is expected that 71 billion people will be forced into poverty. Food security and access to education is expected to get worse. Working hours globally in the second quarter of 2020 was estimated to be 14% lower than it was in the last quarter of 2019. In South Africa, economy has also expected sharp declines. 3 million jobs were lost during the lockdown. 1.5 million workers lost the income in April. 47% of households ran out of money to buy food. And 22% of the respondents to a survey indicated that someone in the household went hungry in the past week of the survey, and 8% reported that frequent child hunger was experienced in the last few days of the survey. Next slide, please. The COVID-19 pandemic necessitated the refocusing of current spending priorities. The immediate response were placed on primary health care provided by provinces, and also on social development shared by national and provincial government. And then there was also a lot of responsibilities placed on peace and security, mainly provided by national government, to increase deployment of the police service and national defense force during the lockdown. But members, we also realize now that the lockdown has actually also created its own challenges, mainly affecting the economy and huge shortfalls on revenue collection that had to be addressed by this adjusted appropriations. Next slide. So members, we know that you are familiar with the revised fiscal framework, but just to emphasize the estimated undercollection of revenue for the year, which is almost 300 billion. And the fiscal framework also shows the net change in expenditure of 43.2 billion until October, when the second adjusted appropriations will be tabled. Next slide. So government indicated that in phase 1 was an immediate or temporary response to preserve the economy, but preliminary observations actually show that some of these changes should or could become the new baselines for allocations, in specific in the national government sphere. The phase 1 also identified 500 billion for economic relief, which includes tax policy measures, loan guarantees, and also 40 billion wage protection, which was also now extended. In terms of the reprioritization, which is mainly the reflected in the adjusted appropriations bill, includes reprioritization of 45 billion, additional allocation of 23.5 billion, And members, then we've spoken a lot about the 19.6 billion. It's not reflected in this adjustments appropriations bill, but it is reserved. It is not allocated, but it is still available, and it will be allocated in October. But we also don't know whether some of this money will be used from now until October, and we actually think that this money should be earmarked in specific for COVID purposes, and members can play a role in that. The table that's on the video now is showing that specifically how government derived at the 23 billion. In terms of the first line, compensation of employees, compensation was reduced by 1.4 billion. This is actually a substantial amount, given that this was done or decided on only 1 month after the beginning of the new financial year. But some of this money has been reallocated. 812 million has been reallocated, which gives us a total change proposed of 503 million. In terms of goods and services, 7.3 billion has been reduced and 7.7 has been reallocated, which gives us an increase of 1.6 billion in goods and services. The biggest amount that has been reduced and reallocated is in terms of transfers and subsidies. This includes transfers to provinces, departmental agencies, and also to households. The biggest amount here is the reallocation, or the increased amount of 25.5 billion to households, which includes the social grants. In terms of the payment for capital assets, in terms of the reprioritization, it actually increased by 182 million. And then the last line there, the payments to financial assets, is the 3 billion that's now been allocated towards the land bank. Not sure how this fits in with the COVID priorities. Next slide, please. The next table also shows or reflects the total of the 23 billion. That was the increase in the total budget, revised budget. Just to show members a selection of departments, and you must realize that we can't show all departments, but these are the ones with the biggest changes to their budgets. Corporate governance was an increase of 10.9 billion, almost 11, which is the equitable shares to the local government. National Treasury increased by 9.3. Higher education and training was reduced by 9.8 billion. Health actually get a small increase of 2.9 billion. Social development increase of 25.5. Defence increased by 2.9, and some of our previous presenters also spoke to these increases and decreases, and the police were increased by 3.7 billion. Then there was also a reduction in the agriculture budget of 2.4 billion. Human settlements were decreased by 2.2, and trade and industry were reduced by 1.8 billion, and transport were reduced by 4.6, and some of the detail is reflected in the next slide. Thank you. So some of the specific increases that we can talk to is in terms of corporate governance. We know that was for the equitable share. On the National Treasury side, there was 7.2 billion increase for interest and 3 billion for the land bank. In terms of health, in specific for COVID, the COVID proportion of the grant was increased by 3.5 billion, and the compensation of employees specific also for that purpose was 26.8 million, and compensation was also increased for primary health care of 50.6 million. In terms of social development, we see an increase of 15.1 billion for child support. Social relief of distress increased by 10.3 billion, and then there was also a small increase of 80 million towards foster care. In terms of defence, the program for force employment increased by 763 million, and then there's a general support program in defence which increased the goods and services by 700 million and the capital assets by almost 800 million. In terms of the police, our defence also increased the military health support program. Goods and services increased by 300 and capital assets 360. No problem with that in terms of health support. In terms of police, the visible policing increased by 4.7 billion. The next slide is just a bit of detail and additional information on the departments directly linked to the pandemic. So in terms of the little table there, the social development is very much involved with the provision of food parcels. So I thought it's important to know how much we pay for these food parcels. So in the Eastern Cape, a food parcel is costing the department 700 Rand. In Limpopo, 800 Rand. In the Western Cape, they spend 400 Rand per food parcel. But also to note that in Mpumalanga, a food parcel is costing the department 1,456 Rand. In terms of the disaster relief funds to municipalities, how these funds were distributed, the Eastern Cape received 28.3% of that grant, KwaZulu-Natal 31.5%, and the lowest proportion went to the Northern Cape of 2.1%. The distribution of the relief grant to provinces were distributed to KwaZulu-Natal was the highest one. That received 29.8%, Gauteng received 24.9%, and also members just to realize that this grant is specifically distributed for protection equipment and also for ventilators. But we must also just, when we do our oversight, we must make sure that we don't buy ventilators for provinces where they don't have beds. The last two columns is just for information purposes, just to show how the conditional grants are normally distributed between provinces and just to compare if there is a comparison with the distribution of the disaster grants. Next slide, please. So this slide is just showing the specific decreases within the departments. In basic education, the decreases were mainly in terms of the infrastructure grant. Higher education, the main reductions were in terms of the transfers to universities and also to the TVET colleges. And then there was also a reduction in the compensation of employees of 73.7 million. And it's actually a very high amount. Just in the administration program of higher education, there was a reduction of 33.6 million for compensation of employees. In the Department of Agriculture, they also reduced the compensation of employees budget by 300 million. This is the biggest amount or the biggest reduction of all departments in terms of compensation of employees. In terms of the food security and land reform program, there was a reduction of 1.8 billion. And in human settlements, the reduction of the conditional grants was 1.1 billion to local government, and to provinces it was 1.7 billion. In terms of trade and industry, the program for industrial financing transfers were reduced by 1.2 billion, of which manufacturing development incentives were reduced by 683.6 million rand. In terms of the transport, and there was also a lot of discussions on these changes, the rail transport were reduced by 1 billion. This includes the reprioritization of the support for lost revenue, and then there was a total reduction to the rolling stock of 1 of 1 billion. And then in terms of road transport, there was a reduction of 2.5 billion. This includes a reduction in road maintenance, but it also includes other reprioritizations from the non-toll road to the Gauteng freeway improvement. And this is something that also happened previously in 2018-19 adjustments. This was also a reprioritization in terms of this funding. In public transport, there was a reduction of 1 billion. And I can also just mention members this is specifically to the network grant. And basically what happened is all provinces were reduced by 15.7%, and then there was the additional surrendering of funds by the City of Cape Town. The next slide, please. Members, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the conditional grants. We've spoken about it. And basically, just something to note, that are some additional analysis that I did, or calculations. I went through basically all the conditional grants to see how the reductions actually was done. And in most of these grants, the grants allocated to provinces were reduced by a percentage. So it was a straight line reduction to everybody, for example, by 10% or 20%, in some cases even 60%. There's only a few grants that I could find that it was different amounts and different percentages reduced to the different provinces. The same is also true for the grants to local governments. So we can skip the next slide and we can continue with slide 16. So members, after saying all of the above, members still need to consider whether you agree with these adjustments, and the committee can also make recommendations for the second adjustments for October. And just to give you some background information, phase 2 is supposed to be a plan to recover from the immediate effects of the crisis by supporting investment and employment. A second wave of infection is expected in the northern countries during this winter, and it looks more likely that South Africa could have a second wave as well in the winter of 2021. And there's likely to be a need to budget for more spending on health as well as on households. Economic disruption is likely to be larger and last longer than anticipated, and therefore the size of further government support budgeting to help businesses and households might be required. And then further adjustments might be required by considering the National Treasury's assessment of spending areas in a zero-based budgeting approach, but also to consider the National Treasury and Provincial Treasury's reviews that has been done, or what they also plan still to be done. But also just to mention, members, is that a lot of reviews has been done over time, and some of them has been presented to the 5th Parliament, but it's not clear whether these recommendations has informed budgets going forward or the current budgets. The Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluations has also done a lot of reviews on programs, and it might be useful for them to come and present the reviews that has been done. Next slide, please. This is just in terms of some of the thinking around what we need to consider for phase 3. And phase 3 is supposed to be a pivot to position the economy for the faster growth needed to restore the country's long-term prosperity. So in terms of the health and trauma associated with the socio-economic impact of COVID-19 and government's measures to respond to these will have to be budgeted for in phase 3 as well. South Africa cannot expect to rapidly pivot to faster growth and prosperity without taking into account the societal context, but also the context of the regulations currently valid. Government spending on consumption and investment would still be the main measures to offset the decline in the GDP. It will take time and a social compact to recover from the socioeconomic impact of this pandemic. It should be realized that the budget deficit and debt to GDP ratio will grow and have to remain higher to a number of years. A move towards too rapid reduction and reprioritization of expenditure to address the debt to GDP levels seems increasingly unrealistic, and a shift towards focusing on structurally higher growth too quickly could be ineffective in an economy where demand, investment and employment has actually crashed. Domestic and global economic demand will likely remain strongly subdued over the medium term. And just in terms of our conclusion, members, basically what we want to say is that there are a lot of things to assess and to consider going forward, because we've seen what we've done. We don't have an idea, or we basically could assess whether some of these reductions and allocations were just a technical exercise, and whether it is sufficient to address the immediate effect or the needs of the pandemic. And members also, whether these allocations actually can be monitored. We haven't seen all the outputs or indicators presented with this budget to be monitored, and also no targets has been set. And something else also to be considered is whether these allocations can be spent or implemented by October before the second budget. Important also is the prioritization of the 19 billion, which are not appropriated, and whether this committee can influence those appropriations, and whether we can make sure that this is earmarked specifically for COVID-19. Something else also to consider is whether phase 1 measures will continue in phase 2, specifically in terms of allocations to health. Which budgets should be restored? Can we restore in phase 2? Can we go back to where we started in 2020? Which budgets can be reduced further or should be increased? And where we can also reprioritize further for phase 2. Something else to think about is, how do we do our trade-offs? How do we think in terms of social needs versus preserving the economy, versus support for investment and employment, versus restoring the long-term prosperity in line with the regulations currently? And also how the goals of building a caring economy with inclusive growth and sustainable development included in the plans to respond to and to recover our economy. Thank you, members.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to PBO for a very in-depth presentation. Now we're gonna have deliberations, questions and clarities from the members from both houses, and I will Lubabalo and Darren to assist us in terms of hands. Do we have any hands? Any members to make deliberations, questions?
The first hand that is up, co-chairperson, is that of Mr. Mlenzana. Chairperson Buthelez's hand is also up. Honorable Ryder.
Honorable Ntlangweni.
Honorable Ntlangweni.
Ntlangweni.
Yes, Chairperson Ntlangweni, Chair. So far, those are the 4 hands, Chairperson. Unless I am I'm missing the other ones, but so far those are the 4 hands, Chair. Just a second. Honorable Joseph, Honorable Karim.
Okay.
Honorable Ocamp.
All right. Any further hands?
Honorable Peters.
All right. Okay, can we?
Honorable Kaiso, Chair.
All right. Okay.
I think so far, Chairperson, those are the hands, unless I have missed 1 or 2. Over to you, Chairperson.
Thank you very much. In the following order, Honorable Mlenzana, Honorable Buthelezi, Honorable Ryder, Honorable Ntangweni, Honorable Joseph, Honorable Karim, Honorable Ocamp, Honorable Peters, Honorable Kaiso. That will be the following order, and we would request if we could stick to the 3 minutes, and we also to make sure that we also manage time. Thank you very much. We start with Honorable Mlenzana.
Thank you, Chairperson. Greetings to all, and let me welcome the presentations equally so. But Chair, I will.
My apology, Honorable Lenzana. Chair.
Yes.
Chair. No. My hand was up. I just wanted to say I'm going to be a timekeeper. So I just wanted to say that all members should know that I'm here. I'm a timekeeper.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Honorable Co-Chair. Thank you very much. Perfect. Thank you very much. Okay, you can continue. Honorable Mlenzana.
Thanks, Chair. I was saying, Chair, my questions go to almost all presenters, but I will indicate where a particular question goes to a particular presenter. For instance, with equal education, I listened carefully when they are querying the addition made to defense and SAPS. Now, I just want to understand from equal education, what is their understanding of the role of defense in the SAPS, particularly in gender-based violence and children abuse, which is so rampant at this time and age, and also the fact that in defense you have got beyond just patrolling, there's medication, there's doctors, there's all that is needed in this period. To COSATU and perhaps others, the PBO raises something here which is very critical around if we are able to look into the expenditure trends vis-a-vis these reductions and what have you that has been done, as to whether are we then realistic when we are crying foul of reductions, when we know that this budget is going to run for only 3 months towards October. For instance, your 2.2 billion reduction in education, was it going to be effectively spent during the 3 months period? This may be a rhetoric question, Chair. I'm asking this based on the zero-based budgeting that we are looking for. Then the last one, Chair, would be, I would require all presenters to make a comment. I've just picked on 3 provinces from PBO regarding nutrition. PBO says to us, the cost of a food parcel, each in Eastern Cape, it's 700 rands. In Mpumalanga, it's 1,456. And in Western Cape, it's 400 rands. I want just to get their thinking around this. Thanks, Chairperson.
Sana, Honorable Ryder.
Thank you, Chairperson. Chair, yes, again, appreciating the presentations and the work that went into them beforehand. I really just want to focus particularly on equal education today, please, and really more of a comment than anything else. The fact is that I think their visual displays of the erosion in the education budget should be a stark wake-up call for the members of this committee, and just show us that our priorities in government have been messed up. The comment was made that education is an apex priority for government, but that's in words only. I mean, you can't say it's an apex priority and then take funding away consistently. And I mean, acknowledging that it's not only during this special adjustment budget that we've been eroding the allocations to education. It's been happening consistently over time. And if you look at the medium-term expenditure framework, it's also planned to continue happening. The fact that not even the gazetted numbers are being met is, to me, it's abhorrent. I do think that Equal Education's comments about the internal reprioritizations were not correct. I think Treasury's done an excellent job with the internal reprioritizations in the current cycle, and I think Honourable Kayuso has touched on that as well. Money that couldn't be spent is now being placed where it can be better utilised and appropriately utilised. Yeah, and then again, Honourable Kayuso already spoke about the other point, the food parcels in different provinces. I think that it's scary that a food parcel can cost 4 times more in some provinces, and that speaks to the massive problems with our procurement system and the levels of corruption in the procurement system. I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you very much, Honourable Ryder. Honourable Ntangweni.
Thank you very much, Chair, and I do apologize for my video that can't go up, Chair. The one point that I want to also emphasize, Chair, that we need to look into, that Honourable Kayuso also raised, is really the costing of the food parcels. And it will link into what I've said the other day in the committee, Honourable Chair, of the digitizing the food parcels as well, so that corruption can't take place. Because you can't have the very same food parcel in Western Cape being paid for 400, and then you go to Mpumalanga and then it just rock up to 1,400. What is in these food parcels anyway that the prices are so variant? And then on the equal education as well, they touch on the infrastructure. We did raise it as well with the minister the other day, and for me, Chair, I don't know how we aim to work with this budget, because now we're having all of this input and it will just go to another report and that report will gather dust. So we need to really look into as well, us as the Appropriations Committee, and as to how we are doing our work. Because when we raised some of the concerns, even with the minister herself the other day, myself, I was called a bully by the minister. So we really need to, I'd rather be a bully than to be part of murdering kids and sending them forcibly to schools where an infrastructure is not right. There's no sanitation and water at schools. So then I'm gladly to be called a bully than a murderer. But we need to really look into how we are doing with our work and our inputs and how we follow up on these inputs, because we are having and getting great presentations. And I'm wrapping up, Chair. We are getting great presentations from the likes of Outer, COSATU, and Equal Education and PBO. And then to follow through on these recommendations, it's really up to us as the Appropriations Committee, because they don't have that mandate and power to follow up on these recommendations that are saying. COSATU yet again raised valid points on the corruption. There's no conditions to the grant, up to the loan of I think, not sure about the amount. I think it's 100 billion. It can be more. I'm not so total sure now on the exact amount. We still don't have conditions attached to these loans, and it becomes pivotal that we know as a country what is our conditions for these loans, Chair. No one is just going to loan you money and just on a gentleman's agreement. There needs to be conditions, and these conditions needs to be open and transparent to all parties. Thank you very much. If there's another more time, Chair, I would like to come back.
Thank you very much, Honorable Tlangweni. Thank you. The next speaker will be Honorable Joseph.
Thank you, Chairperson, and thank you to the presentations. A few points from my side. One comment is that I noted throughout the presentation, with all the presentations, that the word transparency was very relevant and emphasized, indicating that the public out there in the organizations wants to see and experience more transparency. I noted, and I think the other general point is that what the organizations must understand that this is a specific COVID-19 adjustment budget dealing with the pandemic and the crisis. So it is a budget of priority with a specific purpose. And I know some organizations have brought to our attention other requests and general requests that is normally ongoing, but we note that. And I think COSATU have raised the one point about the and a question we must ask ourselves out of the presentations we received is what are we as Parliament going to do about the AG's findings that really tell us that the municipalities is in a state and the fact that COVID-19 has such a direct impact on the ground. We need to have an exercise. I would like to ask COSATU what efforts are they going to pursue to make sure that the door remains open between themselves and the Minister of Finance and Treasury on the wage bill or the wage agreements. I think they must also look at opportunities to keep their doors open. I want to say to OTA, the zero-based budget is the other central thing that we must. And I'm glad that the Parliament Budget Office referred to that. There is the zero-based budget, which is a new concept. I think we all have to get familiar, whether we're in government or outside government, because that is going to guide us into the next adjustment budget or in October when we deal with the medium-term budget policy statements. I think that is, for us as a committee chairperson, also important to understand, and Parliament Budget Office can assist us for our own members. And then we can, in doing so, support the public to understand what the zero budget is before October. I want to just make a point on equal education. It's difficult whether a healthy nation comes first or whether an educated nation comes first. That is always an ongoing debate, but this budget is about health. This budget is about the crisis and the pandemic we are facing. And then I would like to, also the quintile system that was raised. That's an ongoing debate, and I think the Minister of Education must come and assist. There's many schools that needs review on the quintile system and how schools and learners should be supported individually. Comment on Outa about electrification. I think that is a critical point, but I would think it's part of the ongoing point of the focus on the budget. And I know education for many years took most of the slides of the budget, and then health started in the last 2-3 years on that one slide. It is true, started to become more relevant or in the priority terms, and then the pandemic has lifted even further that health is a priority, and we need to get that right. The Parliament Budget Office, Chairperson, a question I want to ask. What is phase 2? My last point, what is phase 2 according to Parliament Budget Office? Because as the doctor have said that even next year winter we may still be faced with this pandemic in a particular way, and then what is the predictions on phase 2? I think that's for us dealing with the budget important. And then the monitoring and evaluation department, I think, is important to assist us in what is happening in the departments in real terms, in real life, that we can learn from that. Thank you, Chairperson. I'm covered with the other points. Thank you.
Thank you, Honourable Joseph. Honourable Karim.
Thank you, Chairperson. As some of us have been repeatedly saying, we can't be absolutely sure about the points we make. And appropriations is always, the budget as a whole is always a matter of trade-offs and finding the right balances. And Chairperson, the term trade-offs has become even more urgent and more relevant and important than ever before, given all the uncertainties, volatilities, unpredictabilities of the COVID times we're in. And I think there's, like I agree with almost 90% of what all of them have said this morning. But what we don't hear enough, well, at least from the 3 civil society stakeholders, is where do we find the trade-offs? Now, it's a bit unfair because they don't have the resources or skills or capacity, and sometimes even the information, to be very much more concrete in that regard. But on the other hand, they have skills, experiences, and knowledge that we don't have as MPs, and I don't think there's enough of that. On the issue of transparency, I hear that all the time, but on the other hand, for what it's worth, all these global organizations regard South Africa as amongst the top 3 for the last 20 years and more, budget processes in terms of openness and transparency. Now, with COSATU, I was struck, I'd forgotten, actually, I didn't pick this up, that 2.2 billion has been lost to PRASA. It may well be necessary in terms of the trade-offs, but perhaps we should ask Treasury about why that is. On the loan guarantee scheme, only this morning there's yet another article in Daily Maverick, which I didn't get to read fully, that questions it, but maybe it was written before yesterday's announcements. But I think we should pursue that further, and I agree with most things Matthew said in that regard. Obviously, all of us agree, as we've been saying repeatedly, reduce illicit financial flows and the like, all of these proposals on behalf of COSATU on slide 17. But now, how do we do these things? He keeps raising it, we keep raising it as committees, but the issue is not what you should do. How do we ensure that it happens? And given COSATU and Matthew's considerable experience, they can offer us more than just saying what's to be done. Then on outer, I think they're right. Accountability has become ever more necessary. In fact, glaringly obvious. If we are in these difficult times, Comrade Chairs, then not just government, but Parliament, not just civil society, Parliament has become far more effective in our oversight role. On the matter of the military, none of us wants a militarized state. I mean, that's what we fought against in apartheid, not least the chairperson, Sifiso Buthelezi, with his MK background. So he and us and the rest of us will fight any military, whoever is the leader. So that's not going to happen outside. On the other hand, the circumstances do require a more active role for the SADF and certainly the police. None of us supports the abuse of power, but they are necessary more than in normal times. And finally, on their side, they're right to point to the horrible performance of the Department of Water and Sanitation. But that doesn't abstract or deviate from the urgent need for water. On equal education, well, of course one agrees with everything they're saying. It's idealistic. given the practical circumstances. They're absolutely correct. But they also don't raise the issue of value for money. We are amongst the highest percentages of budgets anywhere in the world on basic education. But look at the outcomes. And I agree with everything they say. I mean, it's who will disagree with 90% of what they say? But there are trade-offs, and somebody else raised this thing. At the moment, the choice isn't basic education or some vanity project. The choice isn't even museums, if you can call them or basic. It's about hunger. Only this morning again and yesterday, there's another report of so many people actually in starvation. We've never had this before. So, you know, how do you find trade-offs, equal education? Finally, I want to say, okay, I'll drop that and I'm running out of time. But Chairperson Jadu, can I also plead with you to protect Megan's Willie outcome? He's speaking after me. And I am twice his age. And he showed me a lot of disrespect yesterday. Please stop him before he speaks. We'll leave him out of order.
Thank you very much, Honorable Karim. Thank you very much. The next speaker will be Honorable Okamp.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I'm very much afraid.
You're protected.
Thank you. I'm very much afraid of one of Kim Jong-un's firing squad, so I will not go into that again today, Mr. Karim. Honorable Chairperson, thank you very much. My first comments, a few comments to COSATU. We are seeming nowadays to very much on frequent occasions agree with you guys. I agree with you that there are not nearly enough consequence management, especially when it comes to fruitless and wasteful expenditure. And as you rightly said, that the Auditor General's findings come out, and yet there are no consequence management against that. And I think that is one thing that we need to put the step on the field there. I think consequence management is one of the things that we need in this country in order to get our civil servants to do their job and to serve the people. A question to COSATU. We are talking a lot about the wage negotiations between COSATU and government, and we know of the fact that there has been quite a big reprioritization when it comes to the salaries and or no increases on the salaries. Have there been any negotiations in the last few weeks since we last spoke about that, and where are we standing on that? Because we are talking about, sorry for my cell phone going off, Honourable Chairperson, we are talking about that, but we don't know whether it's going to be implemented at this stage. The other question to COSATU is, Mr. Parks, you said, sorry, Honourable Chairperson, let me just put the cell phone on mute. Honourable Chairperson, Mr. Park said that the agricultural sector is the largest or second largest employer in the country. I would just like to find out from him, what will the effect be of the ban on alcohol and tobacco products on unemployment within the agricultural sector? And do they think that something needs to be done in order to protect those workers? In other words, how many people in the agricultural sector will go unemployed due to the ban on tobacco and alcohol products? Then just on equal education, I agree with the fact that we've got a military deployed in our country at the moment due to the fact that, in my opinion, the government does not trust the people to comply with the rules that's being set out. Whereas a lot of money, or a lot of more money, should have been spent on education, on assisting our schools. We heard yesterday evening that our schools can't open now or must be closed again due to the fact that a lot of those schools aren't ready to face this. But I think the main reason for that is the fact that government did not put enough resources into those schools to assist them with proper opening and safe opening. So I agree with you there, but that is my questions. Thank you very much, and sorry again for my cell phone ringing.
Thank you very much, Honourable Okamp. Thank you very much. The next speaker will be Honourable Peters.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. I would like to start by apologizing for the late connection. There was a technical glitch, and I've been struggling, waiting in the corridor to be allowed into the meeting for a very long time. I want to take this opportunity to join those who thanked the presenters, all presenters, including those that I did not hear presenting. I had the opportunity to scan through their presentations and their documents. My first question would be to Equal Education. I'm just asking them to give us an indication. How do you suggest government realize equity in the education system, especially in the present situation, or based on the present situation that has been laid bare by the challenges COVID-19? Secondly, my questions mostly are related to COSATU. COSATU, how are you proposing we deal with a situation now where many of the workers are actually either in hospital or in isolation or in quarantine, especially if you look at the defense force as well as the police force? And I know that in your presentation you make reference to the fact that the president in his State of the Nation address committed to an additional plus minus 7,000, and now we've got more than 10,000 of the police services men and women who are either infected or affected. How should government deal with the situation of teachers who are in the public schools, fear to go to school because they fear to get infected, but equally then allow their children to go to private schools or alternatively do homeschooling for their own children? I'm raising this in relation to the question that I've raised about equity to equal educations. The other thing, the conditions that COSATU refers to under basic education, with the number of schools that don't have sanitizers, don't have PPEs and all those, and the challenge in particular with regard to infrastructure of sanitation and water. I just want to know, is this a discovery to COSATU, or is it something that COSATU has been raising with the Department of Basic Education in the previous pre-COVID situations? I also want to know, COSATU, we were informed about contract hijackers, for a lack of a better word, especially in the Eastern Cape and KZN. What is your views with regard to these contractors who delay the rollout of infrastructure, especially of dealing with toilets or dilapidated latrines, as well as the schools infrastructure in our rural areas, because they demand a 30% share in the contract? Outer, what is Outer's views with regard to a city or a province that surrenders voluntary surrenders funds to the National Revenue Fund, primarily to avoid reflecting an under expenditure? What does it say to you with regard to services in communities? One of the cities that has done that is City of Cape Town, and I would want to hear from Outer, because there's serious challenges with regard to infrastructure for public transport, as well as availability of affordable and accessible public transport for the poorest of the poor. I know this is a question I always like asking Outer. What is your take with regard to non-toll funds in SANRAL being diverted or reprioritized to cover GFIP? I'm raising this. The Department of Water and Sanitation made a presentation before this committee. The Department of Basic Education made a presentation before this committee. They indicated the challenges with regard to the delivery of water in the rural areas, especially the tankering, is primarily because of the infrastructure. And the non-toll fees or the non-toll grants in Sanral are expected to cover those particular rural roads and other particular type of roads. And I want to make an example, co-chairpersons, that we're sitting with a situation of those scooter ambulances or whatever they are called in the Eastern Cape. I would want to say, as somebody who has worked in the Eastern Cape and who has worked in the transport and roads sector, I know that that particular challenge was because the Department of Health in the Eastern Cape was addressing a road infrastructure challenge through that type of intervention that is actually taking us a few years back in terms of transportation of patients. So I would want to know from Outer what you say about this taking from the poorest of the poor and giving to those who can still afford. But also, how does, yes, Chairperson, the last one, how does Outer suggest that the school nutrition program be done during lockdown when learners stay at different parts of the city? You would know that learners are registered in schools of the parents or their own choice. So how would the learners then be able to get to the school to get a nutrition? If the learners could get to school for nutrition, then they can just as well go to school for education. So I'm just wanting to know from Outer, what is your views with regard to that? And equally, that would be a question that I raise with equal education. And if there's an opportunity, I'll come back, Chairperson. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Honorable Peters. Thank you very much. The last speaker on this round is Honorable Kaiso.
Thank you very much, Honorable Chair, Honorable Ryder, and Honorable Ntangwini. I haven't spoken before. It's for the first time that I speak. I've heard you quoting me extensively. Perhaps it was one honorable member who spoke.
Sorry.
No,
but Chair,
yeah.
I only realized after Honorable Wright and Honorable Ntangwini spoke that you have got some similarities yourself and Honorable
Wise words from you.
I noticed that.
This similarity. Hey, yeah, thank you very much. No, I think a lot of input that I also picked up from COSATU and other organizations, I think can be best located further during the October medium term budget processes. So, but I want to get to issue that was presented by Office of the Parliamentary Budget Office. The expenditure or the report on how municipalities and provinces have received or have received their expenditure when it comes to relief funds. So I don't understand what does that mean when you say when a province like say Free State has expended 2.7%, 5.7%, and the rest. So that expenditure, it doesn't reflect quite well given the situation that our people are facing now during this difficulty of COVID-19. So I just want to get to know from you, what does that mean now? Because it's a very abnormal situation there where you find a relief fund has not been expended whilst people are experiencing such difficult problem. I want to venture into this area now from the PBO's office. In your view, because now the president has talked about the issue of establishment of a sovereign wealth fund, the Presidential Infrastructure Coordinating Commission to unlock the backlog of infrastructure. So where do you locate all these discussion that I've talked about in the current difficulties? More so that you are saying there must be an advancement to grow the economy. But I haven't heard the PBO's office making a remark on those issues, including the one that says the illicit flow of money in the country. I know that I want to talk this in the context of COVID-19 now, because it's one of the instruments that is laid before us, but I haven't heard you saying, but this is an opportunity that we can talk about the establishment of wealth fund moving forward to ignite, growth in the strategic sectors of the economy. I just want to get in there. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you very much, Honorable Kaiso. Co-chair, it's now 10 to 11, and I'm just going to give those members who wanted to have a second bite 2 minutes to have their second bites, which was I've got two members that I have, Honorable Ntangweni and Honorable Peters, and then if there's any other member to indicate to give 2 minutes, and then in the response, then I will give you to take the response and also to make the closing of this meeting after the responses, and so that we know that we are done. So I'm going to give each member who still have want a second bite, the two members I've identified, Honorable Ntangweni and Honorable Peters. Is there any other member who want a second bite? Any other member?
Thank you, Chairperson. My questions would be now related to PBO. PBO or Parliamentary Budget Office, can you help this committee understand that, in your view, which of the reductions were avoidable, or which ones should this committee actually, or let me rephrase my questions. Of all the proposed budget adjustments, which ones should you say we should, as this committee, directly focus on and overlook the others? The other thing is the PBO office believing that the NDP objectives are still attainable. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Honorable Peters. Honorable Ntangweni.
Thank you very much, Chair. Mine is just maybe perhaps to PBO or any of the other organizations that maybe can have done work into it. Sorry, have we find or have done any research on how many of the unemployed South Africans have actually received the 350 promised for the last 6 months, or for the next 6 months? Sorry, have they done any work or look into it on that grant? And then as well, on the 21st of April, Chair, we were told that 100 billion will go towards job protection and creation, and only 6 billion is evident in the supplementary budget. This one is also maybe perhaps going to PBO to look into it. And then yet again on healthcare, we're told 20 billion in healthcare, and I can only see 2.1 billion of new money, despite the collapse in healthcare and corruption and the massive shortage of PPE. That is the only 2 or 3 that I have now, Chair. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, honorable members. Just to double check, because before we go to the responses, where I will be handing over to the co-chair, Honorable Buthelezi, are there any other member who would want to make any remark? Any other member?
Chairperson, Dennis Joseph.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to comment on the COSATU's point about that we have to reverse under trade and industry, the cuts are 1.7 billion. And particularly tourism, the cut there of 1 billion. But I think I want to say to COSATU that there's a 3 billion going to the land bank, although money is taken from agriculture. But the 3 billion to the land bank is a critical decision, important one that we will support. But I do understand, because we as a committee ourselves have decided, listening to all the various committees, is that small business, medium business, save lives is important, but to get the economy going and to create jobs, in principle, want to support that. It is a very important point that is raised. We, as a parliament and government, must find a way to grow the economy on phase 2, and as public budget office says, even phase 3, which is a long-term view. We have to start making plans on how to grow the economy. Thank you, Chairperson.
Thank you very much, honourable members. Co-chair, as I'm going to give to you to handle the responses, I just want to say that indeed the budget is for the COVID-19 and also to support vulnerable households, so that we, in terms of the focus, so I think the exercise of today, so that we understand what do we want the outcome to be. So therefore, thank you very much, Co-Chair, and I hand over to you.
Thank you, Chair. No, I'll just ask my question, and you must continue with your business of chairing. I chaired alone yesterday, so I'll just ask questions and
okay.
Yes. I think this one goes to all the presenters, those who want to respond. I just want to check whether we have looked at the criteria which was used for reprioritization of the budget. And then say, for instance, a lot of the main criticism of the supplementary appropriations bill is the question of the cuts. So if I were just to pick one criterion that was used, is the one of the departments or institutions which are not spending money. And PRASA is a case in point which has been raised by COSATU. What is the proposal? Was that money to be left there, which is there in PRASA accounts, and it's not a yesterday's thing. And it's very clear from Treasury. It's not the first time they're cutting from there, but still the money is not being spent. But I'm just saying one of the criteria which is being used is non-spending of the funds. Are you then saying, are you against that type of a cut? I'm just saying, the question to everybody, have you looked at the criteria that has been used to reprioritize the budget? And then I think PBO made a presentation of the food parcels. But what was lacking in that comparison? Are we comparing apples with apples? Are we sure that what is being in 1,500 a food parcel and the one which is 400 is the same thing? Because we may be encouraging the 400 rand parcel only to find out it's a starvation food parcel, or perhaps we may be encouraging the 1,500 rand food parcel only to find out all what is there are inflationary prices. So I think that it's very important that we hear that. I think from our side, I think this thing of using vouchers and so on to give people so that they can decide what they want to buy is much better. And again, I don't think it looks good when people in different provinces in the same country are being given different amounts of money. I think if it's standard, it should be standard. But I'm just saying, I'm comparing apples with apples now. And then COSATU, there's cutting, and I know that I just want to check with COSATU, have you interacted with this industry to also understand exactly what are the issues there? Because it looks like the problems which are there are evergreen. And I know that, for instance, the tax recapitalization program is one program that has been cut, and it's one program where it has not been really used, but year in, year out, we do make a budget. But I just want audit outcomes of local government. I think it's one thing that these committees have been raising year in, year out in all the interactions that we're having with SALGA. But there's this one of towns which is said that their revenue or tax base is just non-existent. You know, there are towns which were viable up to 1994. I'll tell you towns, for instance, which were dependent in coal mining. The ones that I can relate to will be Glencoe, Vryheid, Utrecht, Dundee. But for some reasons, came 1994, and all of a sudden there was no coal in those areas. But I'm just saying that, and which makes the towns not viable. What is your proposal? How do we deal with those? Because there's just no revenue, but there are services, people who are there, there are services which must be delivered. And obviously, I shouldn't be misunderstood to say just because of that, therefore people should not account. Even if people are given 10 cents, they should account for that 10 cents. And in equal education, and obviously they say if we have got a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So equal education will be by definition looking at education. But obviously, as Honorable Karim was saying, there's so much trade-off here. But I just want to put this one before you. Is it your expectation that the budget allocation to education should always be increasing? I'll tell you why. Because at the beginning, there was a lot of backlog, apartheid backlog that we needed to catch up with, for instance, in the building up of schools and so on. So my hypothesis will say that along the way, we'll take care of that, and then you might see the budget going to education decreasing. So is it an expectation that you look at the percentage of the budget going to education has been decreasing, therefore that becomes a problem? And again, that talks to all of the presentations. Do we really see, because we are concentrating so much on the amount allocated, I don't hear you talking about many other things, and it creates an impression that money is a panacea to the problems that we are having. For instance, if we were to give the whole budget to education, I would then think that the educational problems will be solved, and I would argue definitely not. But I think equal education, you get my point. Yeah, I think the defense, if I were to talk about defense, when we interacted with national treasure, there's a problem that defense is sort of a black box. But amongst other things, people always look at the defense as a place where people only shoot guns, and that's not the case. We know, for instance, that lots of pilots who are with South African Airways are the pilots which were trained by the South African Air Force. But currently, we're told again that the health services of the Defense Force are also going to be involved with the health crisis that we are facing. We also know that, for instance, they have also been deployed in the Val Dam pollution problem. So I'm just saying, are you saying the Defense Force should not be involved on those things? What's your take on that? PBO, can I just hear exactly on whether you can expand on the money volunteered back by provinces? where did this money come from, and from your perspective, what's going to be the impact of that voluntary surrender of the finances. COSATU, about the credit guarantee scheme. Do you think that is just enough to use the banks for this credit guarantee scheme? And do you think it will reach all the intended recipients if you only use the banks as the outlet? And what is your comment if we were to say that you also need to use the DFIs, and you also need to use the provincial developmental institutions? Those will be my questions, Honorable Chair.
Thank you very much, Honorable Buthelezi. Now we are going to have the responses from the submissions. Honorable Co-Chair, I'm checking time is 4 minutes past 11, so I will try to say that the responses to be squeezed into, if possible, 3 minutes, but so that we don't take more time in terms of the National Assembly, the last agenda point. So we'll go straight to COSATU to respond.
Chair, I think you can be liberal and give the responses about 10 minutes, which I think will still be able to deal with our issue.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. Okay, COSATU.
Cool. No, thanks very much, and thanks, Commissioner Shenge, for the extra minutes. 3 minutes is going to be a tough one. Thanks to honourable members. Just to be quick, to Honourable Mlenzana, we would actually welcome and support the involvement of the police and the Defence Force. Those personnel have been playing a critical role in assisting government to enforce the lockdown. So we support those additional allocations to them. Chair, I think our concern around, to Honourable Mlenzana, about the reprioritization is about the possible negative impacts. If it's about reprioritization to deal with wasteful expenditure, under expenditure, or luxury expenditure, we support that. But we are quite concerned in the key service delivery departments like health and education, police, correctional services, about the consequence of freezing vacant posts. And that's having huge strain. You can see in the hospitals, instead of having 6 nurses on duty, you have 1 nurse. You have a doctor working 48 hours. And what is the consequence of those personnel being overstretched? We really also wanted to see the economic cluster departments being reprioritized, because as much as we must save lives, we must also save jobs. A healthy person cannot remain healthy if they're unemployed. I think, Chair, the one difficulty with the budget is a lack of real content in it to say, what is the nature of the cost and the reprioritization? Is it useful or is it not helpful? And the way the budget is formulated, often I think at times it disempowers members of parliament and the public to really understand the nitty-gritties. To Honourable Nhlangweni, and I think even also Honourable Buthelezi also raised it, the 200 billion rand guarantee. I think we welcome the Minister's interventions yesterday, but we think we need to do much more. And even talking to some of the businesses who have been part of those discussions, there are too many conditions and burdens to them to really fast track it. We think it needs to be further unlocked, and there should be weekly reports to Parliament in that regard. But I think, Chair, for us, it is critical, it can't be a blank check, that there has to be some jobs conditions attached to it, that will give you money if you save jobs, will incentivize or convert the loans to grants if you create jobs. So it has to be a carrot and a stick approach, but it can't be a blank check. Otherwise, you'll give me a bailout and then I'll just simply retrench workers and not assist. I think also, Honourable Nhlangweni, we've seen lots of complaints about the 350 Rand unemployment grant that's been rolled out. If you go to post offices, workers queue there for hours only to be turned away because there's no money available. We would want to see more fast tracking the 100 billion Rand jobs creation program announced, because there's not much detail in there. But at least on a positive note, Comrade Chair, we can say that by today, about 35 billion Rand has been released by the UIF for the COVID-19 relief to over 7 million workers. An additional 4 billion Rand in normal UIF payments has gone out, and we welcome the government's extension of the UIF by another 6 weeks. I think Honourable Joseph, and I think also Honourable Okamp, about the wage bill. Look, we as COSATU don't want to see the state collapse. If the state collapses, we know the first casualty will be public servants who would have the wages docked, the pensions cut, retrenchments, etc. The wage agreement for this year is the lowest in many, many years. So unions have been willing to compromise. We had gone as COSATU to the leadership of the Alliance and the government in November last year to propose a raft of proposals, including how we can save costs on the wage bill. The discussions currently is at the Public Service Bargaining Council. The mediation didn't work, it's now at arbitration. There is also a court case as well. But our simple thing is implement the 2020 agreement. Let's fast track the next 3 years because there are numerous ways we think we can significantly save money there to assist government. But it is quite worrying, Chair, how government is walking away from wage agreements now also at a municipal level. And that really is going to demotivate and provoke workers when we can least afford it. I think, Honourable Joseph, look, for us, the issue of jobs is so critical and the role that DTI plays is so fundamental. It just didn't make sense. And we've had complaints from unions and from the bargaining councils in the clothing industry in particular about the cut of 1.7 billion rand from DTI and from the industrial financing program. That is money which is well spent and it's going to have a jobs impact upon us. So we would really encourage Parliament to exercise its powers to reverse that one. We did support the land bank injection, which is badly needed. I think, Honourable Karim, we would agree with you 200%. There has to be trade-offs. There has to be a social compact between government, business and labour, where all of us compromise and contribute and even sacrifice. That is what had motivated us to go to the lines in November last year and in December to put on the table a raft of proposals. We had even said we are willing as COSATU to help save Eskom, to support financial mobilization for it, to help reduce the debt and make many compromises on it. We took a lot of flack for that, but for us it's about saving Eskom, contributing towards saving the economy and saving jobs. We had even made proposals, Honourable Karim and Chair, about how we can contribute around the wage bill, around reprioritization of the budget, around wasteful expenditure, infrastructure, impact investments, because government can't do it on its own. Unfortunately, we felt the government didn't take those proposals seriously, except the Eskom one. Chair, but I think we would welcome Honourable Karim, Parliament playing an active role around the 200 billion rand credit guarantee. Also, Honourable Okamp around agriculture and the alcohol and tobacco. We met with the alcohol industry yesterday and earlier in the week. We are very worried. We do understand and support government on the health intervention because the ICUs and the trauma units at hospitals were being clogged up with victims of alcohol abuse. And we have a serious problem as a nation that we don't behave responsibly as individuals and how we consume alcohol. And workers pay the price in road accidents, in domestic violence, at the hospitals. But we are very worried about the job impact from farms to bottling, to manufacturing, to retail, to restaurants. We met with government yesterday. We've set up a smaller task team in NEDLAC of government, business and labor to see what support can we do. We've told the industry, you need also to come up with concrete, practical proposals about how to reduce alcohol abuse. It might include restricting sales, but also the industry having to contribute towards healthcare costs. But also equally, Chair, we challenge government. You must come with some sectoral support for the alcohol industry. There's up to 1 million jobs which may be at stake in the broader scheme. And you need to give some support for restaurants which are on the knees, etc. And this is an industry now which cannot sell it all. So there's a need for dedicated support, but equally, Chair, the banks must also come to the party and give relief to the industry. I think to Honourable Peters, Comrade Chair, we were very worried. The infection rate of essential workers is about 4 to 6 times higher than the national rate. We need to unfreeze those vacant posts in the critical service delivery departments and to reinforce those departments. Around the schools, our understanding of the President's announcement, which was in response to all the teachers' unions across federations, was to give 4 weeks for the department to get its act together, to put in place the sanitization programs. We hope they'll now do it. The private school issue, yeah, it's going to raise issues of inequality, but it's largely because they've been able to enforce, because of being better resourced, the infrastructure and social distancing. But Sister Poor, we've been raising the issue of the school infrastructure for many years. SATU has been raising it in bilaterals with the minister. We've been raising it at Parliament every single year. And we don't feel the government department has listened to us seriously. The fact that every year we delay the sanitization in schools and rural areas is an indictment upon us as a nation and the department. Sister Poor, there was even a report of a ghost school in Eastern Cape where the money was paid, but no school was built. I mean, it's bad. Just coming to the end, Chair, to Honorable Kaiso, my former COSATU CEC member, we would support an engagement share between government, labour and business at NEDLAC to see what compromises can we come for the medium-term October budget statement, where we can present a united front to save the economy and to get the third phase rolling out quickly. We can't wait for February, and government can't do it on its own. Then, Honorable Shenge, look, we did call upon government to reprioritize the budget from wasteful expenditure, from under expenditure, from luxury expenditure. The budget doesn't really give you a sense of what kind of reprioritization has been done. Some areas look positive, like in the health front, but the economic front looks very worrying. It doesn't make sense, Chair. We understand the argument. If PRAS is not spending the money, you can't just simply leave the money there. But then surely the response should be to intervene at PRAS and put in place the management systems to make sure they spend the money. PRAS has a critical transport mechanism for workers in the cities, and it's collapsing. It's in a serious crisis, and we don't see the government intervening to deal with it. Honorable Chair, we had supported government when it announced the food e-voucher system. We thought that was a useful way of getting money to workers, to people who are desperate. It's disappointing government hasn't gone with that option. I think lastly, Comrade Chair, we have had many meetings with Santaco, with the Taxi Driver Association, with the Minister of Transport at NEDLAC, and even bilaterally as COSATU. We support the 1.1 billion rand taxi relief. Chair, the taxi industry has suffered like other sectors, but it has to be conditional. There has to be the 70% social distancing if we want to curb the spread. But also, Chair, the taxi industry has to come to the party with its behavior. They have to register for UIF for the workers, for COIDA for the workers, because those workers are not registered for them now. They have to pay their taxes. And of course, Chair, as all of us would know, the taxi industry needs to deal with the issue of surplus overcrowding in terms of the amount of permits you issue, which leads to this kind of behavior of breaking traffic rules, etc. But I think, Comrade Chair, Honorable Buthelezi is right. It's not just about money. Department of Education has lots of money. It's about management. Are they spending the money correctly? Are they dealing with wasteful expenditure? Are they dealing with corruption? Are there consequences and accountability, which we don't feel there are? Lastly, Comrade Chair, to Honorable Buthelezi, we would support not just relying upon the banks to roll out the 200 billion rand. We will support involving the DFIs, small lenders, other emerging banks, because clearly right now, the bottlenecks in the banks shows you there's a problem. So we need to get the money out. I think that is, for us, is the critical thing. Get the money into the economy, and let's not delay it. I hope I've answered the questions, Chair, and stuck to the time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, COSATU. Yeah, I believe you have quoted all members as per questions. I believe that there is no member that would so thank you very much. Thank you very much. Some noise somewhere. Then thank you very much to COSATU once more. The next one will be Outer.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you to the members for all the good questions. I'm just going to make a few overarching comments. Thank you for the time to do that before I get to specific questions that were asked to me. And the first is, I think we strongly agree with the idea that reprioritizations must be context specific. And the FFC has also raised this issue that there are blanket approaches to how the provinces' grants are being decreased regardless of the unique context in each of those provinces. But let me get to the specific questions. And also to say, Chairperson and members, we want to agree with this publication that was made by the Minister of Finance last week, I think it was, that we cannot spend ourselves out of the situation we are in, that reforms are necessary to really achieve some kind of meaningful change. Strongly agree with the sentiments in this committee that more money will not necessarily solve our problems and that we should not be too focused on the numbers. So there was a question on should we really criticize reductions to departments who misspend. So of course, we agree that those departments that do not perform should not just get the same amount of money. And that doesn't make sense. But at the same time, underspending on certain programs doesn't necessarily mean that those programs are not important. And we think there needs to be a really careful qualitative analysis in cooperation with the people who are supposed to actually benefit from these programs on whether they are necessary, whether they are essential or not, and that it should not be left to National Treasury and government to decide. There was a question on food parcels. There were a few saying that expenditure is different in every province. That is a fundamental problem. What is going on? And we think that the Public Procurement Bill can go a long way in addressing that once it's enacted, although that bill also provides for transparency. Members, we really think that that bill must focus on, prioritize openness. And even though, Mr. Karim, Honorable Karim, you say that we are ranked among the best in the world in terms of budget transparency, but there's a difference in access to information and accessibility, and whether the visibility of what happens means that people can actually influence what happens, and we cannot. This forum that we are in here today is the closest that I know of an opportunity for any member of the public to really influence the budget. And let's be honest, the outcome of these public hearings is usually not felt. It's not immediately apparent whether this has any impact at all. So I think we strongly say that we need to walk the talk, and talk is cheap. And it's important to confront qualitative problems, chairpersons and members, that people don't trust government anymore. We strongly believe, and I'll get to the specific questions on the nutrition and so on, and there are questions on how that should be managed. But there needs to be partnerships with civil society in local government, in provinces, to ensure that there's proper oversight and to ensure that the sole responsibility for how money is spent isn't only on executive and accounting authorities, who are often manipulated and who don't immediately and effectively report on how that money is spent. There was a question on the role of the SAPS and the Department of Defense in gender-based violence and child abuse. Isn't it a good thing that they can actually help with those problems? Of course. I think we can all agree on that. However, that's a reactionary question, and I would pose the question, what is the role of economic collapse and government-enforced hard lockdown on gender-based violence and child abuse? These are causes, and what the SAPS and the Department of Defense can do is really a sort of symptomatic relief. And we really need to get to the root causes of those kinds of social ills in South Africa. And giving more money to the Departments of Defense and Police serves as testament to how we are really a country of violence, where we would rather impose violent solutions to problems as opposed to proactive ones of education and ordinary healthcare. So transparency is a strong theme, yes, which we really want to highlight and repeat. It is something that we believe is essential to achieve zero-based budgeting. And only one of the members spoke to electrification, which I highlighted in our presentation. And I'm concerned to see that there isn't strong response to that. Can this committee request that the Minister of Mineral Resources and Energy reconsiders his deprioritization of electrification? We strongly recommend that. And Honorable Karim asked about trade-offs. Where are they? So we are really asking, as the public, we are asking this committee, we are asking government where those trade-offs are. We recommend, for example, that the Departments of Police and Defense do not receive more than 7 billion rand in additional allocations, and that those monies rather go to other sectors, especially because we do not have extra money on hand. So yes, absolutely, accountability is really the core of our recommendations. In terms of what the SAPS and the Defence Force can do for other social services or environmental services like the Vaal River cleanup, and what the Department of Water and Sanitation must now do and how important sanitation is, yes, of course, but there's not accountability there. And that is why we recommend that fiscal discipline is enforced by not giving them exactly what they ask for. We're also recommending a qualitative solution in the Department of Water and Sanitation in the shape of an independent water regulator, which I believe the Minister of Finance also supports. Now, there were specific questions on cities that surrender money to the National Revenue Fund when they don't spend money. We do not agree with that. We completely agree that cities need to spend more on public transport and these kinds of issues, but what shape does that take? So the Competition Commission has recently suggested that PRASA basically loses control of the metro rail because of how poorly it has been managed. We agree with that. That management would then go to metropolitan municipalities, and in turn, there would have to be more accountability from them. And we're also looking at the Economic Regulation of Transport Bill, which is going to speak to the taxi industry as well, and we would look forward to this committee's take on that bill. On non-toll funds in SANRAL being allocated to GFIB, the Gauteng Freeway Improvement Project, as an anti-poor move, of course, Honourable Member, that is not what we would have liked to see. We've been saying for more than 5 years. I think COSATU has also been saying that e-tolls was a failed scheme from the start. And if those points of advocacy were heeded from the start, the debt would not have increased over time. It would not have reached the point that it has now. And these ad hoc kind of bailouts for SANRAL, taking away money from rural roads, would not have been necessary. So we do think that that is very unfortunate that we are in that position at the moment, but that is as a result of a lack of action earlier on. On the school nutrition program, I think we haven't done focused work on that, Honourable Member, but I think it would be difficult for government to really solve these issues on its own, as other speakers have also said. And there has to be cooperation with civic associations, with learner bodies and parent bodies in specific cities on how to do this. I think there has to be a lot of voluntary work that isn't just driven by government in order to achieve this safely and effectively. Now, on the criteria for reprioritization, I want to ask the question again: how is the Nuclear Energy Corporation of South Africa prioritized over electrification? One of the criteria were those programs that would not have an adverse effect on the public should be cut. But we believe that cutting electrification will have an adverse effect on the public. So we question why that is being done, and we suggest that it should not be done. The same issue with PRASA. Of course, there has to be interventions before they receive additional allocations, specifically in regard to the metro rail. These services obviously are not on par, and giving PRASA more money will not solve the problem. But there has to be qualitative interventions there in its structure. Finally, on the local government audit outcomes, town's tax base just aren't sufficient. Honourable Buthelezi, I completely agree. We've been saying that local government in its current form is not financially sustainable. There needs to be a fundamental reform in the shape of local government. And I don't think we should rely on the views of SALGA, because they suggest that local government simply gets more money. But it's not as simple as that. We believe doing that at this time in the current structure will just be another waste of money. And we've been advocating for high-ranking local government officials to take cuts to their salaries, since they do receive quite good salaries, especially in the context of what's happening now. We think that it should be consolidated at that level of government. And finally, Honourable Buthelezi, I just want to comment on the fact that you said the Department of Defence is a black box. Very much so. The public has no idea what happens there. We know, for example, that the organogram of that department is unfunded, but it is not changed. It is something that they are locked into. But if this money is given to them only because we are in a time of crisis, these issues will not be addressed. And we believe that withholding extra allocations to such departments that are not financially sustainable may go a long way in forcing them to make internal changes that can help us in the long term. That's it. Thank you very much, Chairperson.
Thank you very much to Outa for the responses. Okay, then we'll go to the next responses on equal education.
Thank you. Thank you, honourable members, for all your questions. It's greatly appreciated. I will take some of the questions, and then my co-presenter Daniel will take the rest. With regards to Honourable Ryder's question or statement that he feels that the Treasury got it right on the internal reprioritizations, One of Equal Education's main concern is that many of these reprioritizations have been justified by saying that savings were made either during the lockdown period or through, for example, the fact that infrastructure projects for the year have been cancelled. Our main concern in sort of seeing those as savings to be able to be moved towards the COVID-19 effort is that many of these savings come from a sort of a decrease in the ability of the basic education department to meet its service delivery for learners. For example, savings may have been made in the National School Nutrition Program when they weren't delivering meals to learners. However, those savings essentially meant that many millions of children went hungry. So we also want to sort of point out the issue with classifying that as savings that can then be reprioritized. This again can be seen in the HIV and AIDS Life Skills Grant, and again can be seen in infrastructure. Our concern is that there are some things that are easier to conceptualize as a reprioritization. It may seem less sort of, it may seem easier to cancel longer term projects because, for example, they maybe haven't started yet, or that, you know, it's easy to identify a more immediate need. But our concern is that what is being taken away specifically with infrastructure is the long-term realization of, firstly, the right to education, but secondly, a more equal society. So we are very concerned that these reprioritizations are firstly based off the department not providing adequate service delivery for the period during lockdown, and secondly, really jeopardizing the long-term realization of the basic right to education. It may not be sort of immediately visible now, and so easier to deprioritize, but these reprioritizations will have, and budget cuts will have, a devastating long-term effect in our education sector, which, you know, will only become more and more clear over the years. So yes, that would be sort of my comment to Honourable Rai's question. My colleague will deal with the reality of the fact that trade-offs do have to be made, and he will talk a little bit more to that. Secondly, I would like to address Honourable Joseph's question. The question was whether it is a healthy nation or an educated nation. Our answer is similar to previous speakers' answers, that you can't divorce the two. The same way a jobless individual cannot maintain their health in the long run, we feel that deprioritizing education and firstly, during the COVID-19 period, the safety of communities is very much linked to the safety of schools. So we feel that health is directly implicated in the education sector and the amount of money that is put in the education sector. So we do feel that the fact that schools are reopening means that the health of the nation is tied to the ability for us to fund school sanitation. And then secondly, we just do want to re-stress the long-term effects of deprioritizing education and the fact that we stand to potentially, for this generation of learners, lose a portion of them who are unable to afford to continue to go to school, are forced to have to go to work in order to make money for food for their families. There's a real risk at losing a portion of our learners currently, and we therefore feel that the health of our nation is tied to the ability of, firstly, schools to reopen safely, and secondly, to the ability for education to be maintained during this period of time. It's a less sort of immediate sort of in terms of COVID-19 and health issues right now, but we feel it is equally as vital and will have as devastating an impact as the COVID-19 pandemic if education is not preserved during this time. And then lastly, to Honourable Peter's question is, she asked us to give an indication of how do we suggest that the government realises equity in the education system. Firstly, and I feel this has been covered by other colleagues as well, that there needs to be a focus on the corruption that happens. We have again tried to work with government. We've put our input into this new procurement bill that is coming out to try and find ways to reduce wasteful expenditure, to capacity build within the department, which means that the money can go further. We believe that the money that is in education can be spent more efficiently, which will help us sort of bridge the inequalities. But we really want to drill down the fact that if we do not provide sufficient infrastructure, and that means sanitation and it means water, we will not be able to realize the goals of a more equal education system. So we do really feel that there needs to be a focus on infrastructure and a focus on ensuring the safety of all learners. Then we also would like to note the fact that we have seen now in the COVID-19 period that government can act swiftly. There has been that, despite it being a temporary solution, there's been widespread provision of water tankers to schools. And it's really shown the capacity of government to act quickly when required, or when they find that urgency. And this has really indicated to us that there needs to be more urgency placed on service delivery for infrastructure needs. There needs to be more urgency for service delivery in the basic education sector as a whole. And that does, a budget reflects government's priorities, and we are disheartened by the fact that basic education funding has been decreasing. So there's more that can be done than just increasing funding. And yes, I hope that I have spoken to that. Lastly, just talking about how to provide meals for the National School Nutrition Program during this time. Firstly, it would be a vastly reduced sanitation operation, for lack of a better word, to provide meals to learners as opposed to having learners return to school. So firstly, you could have learners collect from their school. This could be staggered at different times. Learners would not spend a prolonged period of time at school, so there wouldn't be the requirements to implement the sort of extensive sanitation measures that come with opening the school.
So if just over a little bit 1 minute left in the entire.
Okay, thanks. My apologies. Just to finish up, it would, even if there was, for example, so one example would be to collect the meals. Another example would, and learners have indicated their willingness to do so. Another would be to have meals dropped off at learners in various areas. So those would be the sort of ideas for providing schools meals while schools are closed down. Thank you. I appreciate your time, honourable members.
Okay, Chairperson, if I could just answer a couple of the questions. I know we're pushing time.
No, we'll be lenient. We'll give you about 3 minutes to do everything.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Chairperson. I'm going to make 4 quick points, group some of the questions together. Firstly, on your question, Honourable Buthelezi, about whether we need to keep spending on education. Then on the question of spending versus what are the trade-offs and are we getting value for money? And then on the question a few people raised about transparency. But I'll start with just a quick one on the one about SNDF and SAPS. Just to highlight that we're raising that really as a point of comparison, that 2.9 billion rand additional money was allocated to the entire health sector, but almost 7 billion rand to SNDF and SAP. So it was more of and if we look at education, a cut of 2 billion. So it's really to make that comparison. Is this the right way to use our money? Does it reflect that we are, as another member said, trusting people and focusing on raising awareness about how to deal with this pandemic? And a part of that question was, well, is that money being used to prevent abuse of women, etc.? And I haven't looked at what those allocations are for, so I can't comment on that. And if that is, then that would be good. But I do know that the Department of Women and Children was cut in the budget by 133 million rand. And 99 million of that was a cut to the National Youth Development Agency. And cuts were also made to programs of the Commission for Gender Equality. So did the budget have measures to protect women? It's not evident in the budget that was presented. That's the answer there. On the question of do we need to keep funding basic education, before the question of how are we spending money, I think the answer, if Equal Education has done surveys of parents and teachers, they will give you a long list of where money could be spent to improve schools, not just on infrastructure, which does have huge backlogs. And I think that the members are aware of the backlogs that we have. Lots of schools still needing electricity and water and sanitation. And we've seen how that's played out with this pandemic of the schools not being ready. So the money that we're spending there, especially on the poorest schools, it's still redistributive money. It's still giving redress. So when we cut those funds, it is a regressive measure. It does halt and put a brake on the equalization of education. And in response to Honorable Karim, we can actually debate now whether we do spend a high per capita amount on education. I think it is debatable. We don't stand out as spending a lot, even though there are spending challenges. And if you look at how much we spend on the poorest schools, if we compare that per learner spend to other countries, it's not actually that high. So I think this idea that some people have that we spend a lot is not actually true. But it's also true that some of the investments we still need to make will buy us, they're necessary for capacity. So for example, on infrastructure, one of the reasons there was underspending on infrastructure grants is there was a lack of infrastructure planning capacity within provincial education departments. And this was only picked up a few years ago. It's something that PPO and the FFC actually raised. And an additional component to that grant was added for human resources to manage infrastructure, to hire engineers into the public sector to actually plan and make sure that provinces were doing proper infrastructure planning. So there's areas where if you spend money, you can then get better value for money down the line. So it's not just a question of making savings. And then I think it's a little bit unfair to say that we're kind of presenting shopping lists and are idealistic when we are making a lot of recommendations on spending and effectiveness of spending and implementation. We cite in the submission 2 research reports we've done. Equal Education has done one on implementing agents. I'm not going to go into it, but basically looking at how we actually implement school infrastructure delivery and the role of implementing agents and where savings and efficiencies could be made. So we do a lot of advocacy and work on that as well as calling for more spending. And Section 27 has done a detailed look at the rollout of sanitation in schools. And we've done research on that, and we make recommendations to the Department of Basic Education and the Portfolio Committee on Education on that. So we are concerned with the quality of spending. And then just to reiterate the question of transparency, final point is just to let the committee know that Section 27 and Equal Education got in contact with the National Treasury and the Department of Education about 3 months ago, sending letters and asking questions directly to the Minister and to the Director General about how the education budget was going to be reprioritized. Unfortunately, most of the requests for information that we got in those letters were refused. So we then made a legal request through the PIA Act for information, and that was also largely refused by the National Treasury and the Department of Education, as well as our request for public opportunities for public participation in the reprioritization question. So this is what we say in the submission is we'd like this committee to think about how it can also support some of these calls for more public participation and transparency in the budget process. And the critical thing is earlier in the budget process, before the budget speech. But thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We'll then have the last response from PBO.
Thank you, Chairperson. I will start and then Siraj and my other colleague will continue. In terms of the food parcels, you remember the Department of Social Development presented to us how much provinces have spent and the numbers of parcels that they've distributed. So it was just those numbers used to calculate the amount spent per parcel. There's nothing in terms of the content of the parcels. It's just basically the amount spent versus the numbers that were distributed. So, and I totally agree with you. One must seriously think about how do we go about, or as Honourable Buthelezi was saying, whether the voucher system is perhaps not a better option to go for instead of the food parcel option. Then in terms of the City of Cape Town that surrendered the money, it's not basically just giving the money back. The reason they've given is that there was a delay in the planned construction of the network, or the expansion of the network, and it's also up to us to then monitor when this money will be reallocated again, whether it will be in the adjusted budget or perhaps next year or over the medium term, but it will have to be returned in for that purpose. In terms of the there was a question or a question about Honourable Kayisu about understanding the expenditure. Those numbers that were reflected is not the percentage spent, it was the percentage allocated per grant to the provinces. Those were the numbers that were reflected or presented by COCTA. So I just calculated the percentage per province, how it was distributed. And then there was a question about the reprioritization and the reductions. That's basically these reductions were mainly not based on performance, because it was only 1 month into the financial year. So there was not based, most of these reductions were based just in terms of a blanket approach. I basically calculated all the percentages, and as I indicated, some of the grants, for example, were reduced by 10%, 15%, and it was like really a blanket approach. And one must also realize the amount for reprioritization was set before the reprioritization was actually done. And then there was a question in terms of the NDP, Honourable Peters. It's something very close to my heart. The NDP was initially, the process that they were initiated or started with or planned to do is through the 5-year medium-term strategic frameworks, and the reporting was in terms of the program of action. And the PBO really started with monitoring the progress of the implementation of the NDP. There was no reporting on the progress in the last year of the first 5-year medium-term strategic framework. And if the presidency will continue in the same methodology or process for implementing the NDP through the medium-term strategic framework and the program of action, for the new MTSF, we haven't seen the medium-term strategic framework for 2019 to 2025, and now we also can't monitor because we don't have any targets set for this period. But what we've actually also seen in our previous analysis of the implementation of the NDP, that is the program of action and the reporting is actually not working. They must actually look at a different methodology or process how to implement the NDP by integrating the targets and the outputs through the APPs of departments. I will now hand over to Siraj.
Thank you very much, Lilia, Honourable Chair and members. I'm going to start off with the question, just to check, can everybody hear me?
we can hear.
Yes, okay. Sorry,
Yeah.
I just
can hear you.
see any responses on the faces I can see, so I was wondering.
Also, adjustments, not to interrupt you. Can we handle it as additions so that we also check in terms of how we manage the time?
Yes.
Thank you very much.
I won't be long, and also my colleague Dr. Jaintis will come in as well. So I'm going to deal with the question by Honourable Joseph in terms of phasing, and the DG National Treasury yesterday again spoke about how this process we're involved in is a bridge towards the medium-term budget in October, and I think that's something we need to think about in terms of the phasing, and the phasing that the first time I saw it was in the 30th of April presentation by National Treasury when they were talking about the response, the impact and response to the pandemic, and since then we haven't really thought through updating the timeframes. So we had the first phase would be 6 months, the next phase 2 would be 6 to 12 months, and then we'd have the third phase, which is the recovery. But we're also seeing there's a lot of overlap within the phases, and that even in the first phase, when we're supposed to be dealing particularly with health and helping households and businesses deal with the downturn, we're seeing that overlap between especially phase 1 and 2. So I think it's really important that as we move towards the MTBPS and maybe even before, provide more certainty to people, and in the thinking as we start shaping what the new fiscal framework will be and move towards thinking about the new budget in February, that we start thinking about the longer term impact of the pandemic on South Africa. And that's why in our presentation we spoke about the likelihood of second waves. And one of the things that's become clear from the medical experts working with government and others who comment on this is that, you know, until there's full vaccinations, we're going to see this pandemic be almost like a forest fire. It's only going to stop when there's nothing left to burn. You know, the infections will only stop if people aren't vaccinated, and it's going to stop when there's nobody more to infect. So we are looking at the longer term impact, and we've just seen the numbers from that NIDS CRAM looking at April to June impacts. The 3 million lost jobs, the number of households going hungry, children going hungry, and so I think the issues of is government going to stop after this first 6 months and maybe the little extensions because of delays with the support, with the relief and disaster, or is that going to then fold over into a possible phase 2? Are we going to, and yeah, it's really important, I think, for households and business, because from a macroeconomic perspective, the issue of certainty and the levels of very high uncertainty and insecurity caused by the pandemic on households and businesses, I think, as we were saying in our previous presentations, that government becomes the anchor in the situation and creates the space for more certainty. And so if government the earlier government comes out to say, this is what else we can do, this is given we see the future fiscal framework, etc., the better it will be for businesses and households. We're not expecting businesses to come in and invest, but businesses actually need to think through how they're going to reopen, how they're going to bring people back to work, etc., those that have been closed. And the other thing, we showed this in our quarterly economic bulletin with reference to a country like Sweden, is that even when you are open, you're affected by the pandemic, and it doesn't mean that your economy suddenly takes off. and that you have reversals. And Sweden's experience, according to the article we quoted in the New York Times, was that they've just had as much damage as the neighboring countries and other countries that did close down for a period, whereas Sweden stayed open. So I think we really need to think through what we're thinking, we're seeing, and we're saying that in phase 3, we're going to be faced with a lot of damage, a lot of trauma. People are talking about the mental health effects and other effects of COVID, and whether that's going to be part of our phase 3 recovery. And there's a warning that we shouldn't move towards trying to cut expenditure and balance the budget too soon, but to actually think through that. And linked to that, and the question of the Sovereign Wealth Fund and the NDP has come up, is that how do we then...
Okay, you're on injury time now.
Okay, sorry. Okay, I'm going to take 30 more seconds, and then I hope you'll give my colleague Masani time. So the question is, how do we then, within our second and third phases, start looking at not necessarily trying to move towards reducing debt to GDP levels too fast, but having that recovery phase back in and dealing with our concerns. And the last point I wanted to make here was linked to the issue of school and basic education, for instance, is that part of our problem is that we're not treating what we see in budgets as government consumption enough as investment. And that investments in school infrastructure, but also in basic education and systems, has huge waves, and the success of it into the economy and the success of the economy. The number of children who learn to read affects their role in the workforce, but it also affects how they respond in the future to health problems and other things. Sorry, Chair. So I'm going to ask my colleague Dumasani to come in at this point. Thank you.
Thank you,
Chair. With your permission, guys, was just saying, with your permission, Tumsan, 2 minutes and wrap it up.
Okay, thank you so much. Good morning, all members and colleagues. My video is not working. I'll just quickly rush through. I think, Chair, honourable members, the point I wanted to start with, I think the supplementary budget started out with two main objectives: to deal with pandemic, but also try to deal with the economic issues. And I think what we're trying to emphasize is that that's how the committee should also look at reporting on the current adjustment budget, as we've shown in the revised framework and the DORA presentations in that regard. The issue of the cut or the reprioritization of infrastructure expenditure, it's true that some of the money would have not been spent, hence they had to be reprioritized, to deal with pandemic as the government has proposed. But I think the concern is that the privatization of infrastructure has been happening for many years over the years. And I think the issue that we've raised before and we've raised now is that the issue of long-term implications of that in service delivery. And I think that should be one of the criterion, Chair, as you asked earlier. If we look at the criterion should also take into account reprivatization cutting should be taken into account, or the government should respond to what will be the service delivery implications of that. So I think certainly until recently, as we're saying, there has been strategies by government to try to have a strategy on infrastructure spending. But I think the other issues of legislation, which we have been raised before in terms of how does the legislation, I remember there was one case where one department was raising to say, look, if we spend on projects, it takes a while to plan, to do feasibility study. As a result, when we come to the end of the year, we have not done much spending, and the PFMA says the money should be returned back to fiscal, sounding like it's an underspending, as it relates to also case raised by my colleague earlier. And I think that is an issue that worth taking into account, because certainly infrastructure have long-term effect on service delivery and also on economic development. So I think that's the point I want to emphasize. The second point on which departments, which prioritization we need to focus on, I think many have been raised. I think one point that I want to emphasize is around spending on research, innovation, and new technologies. Very important aspects. When you look at the literature, Chair, honour members, on post-crisis, certainly that's the one area where the emphasis of spending has always been to say ensure that you have better expenditure on research, innovation, and new technologies, because there's opportunity to open up more growth or economic development opportunities. And I think there has been a lot of discussion between the government and those areas. And I think it's worth monitoring by the committee, where the Department of Higher Education had raised concerns about how much they were required to cut. It will have impact on their sustainability of the research and entities. And I think it's worth taking that into account, as it has a long-term, effect on the economy in some of the sectors of the economy in that regard. And then the other point I wanted to comment on was on the last point, the 7 million, how many 350s have been, 350 applications have been processed. The minister says 7 million applications were received, and out of that, 3.5 million has been approved and has been paid. And I think there's additional 1 million that is being reconsidered also in that regard. And the last point on illicit flows, I think SARS has been doing a lot of work to try to build up its technology and some of the mechanisms to deal with the issues of illicit flows. And I think the finance committees have been getting updated in that regard. But I think the areas that have been considered, which we have raised as well, Chair and members, is around the digital economy. How much our potentials are there in terms of economic growth, or open up other sectors, but also how much additional revenue could be raised in that regard. And I think government is scheduled to update the committees in this regard. Thank you so much, Chair, honourable members. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Co-Chair. Thank you very much, members. Thank you very much, COSATU, OUTA, Equal Education, PBO. Thank you very much. We have come to the end of this meeting. I'm handing over to the Co-Chair, Honourable Buthelezi. Thank you very much.
Let me also thank you, Chair, and other members and everybody who participated. Thank you very much. The joint sitting is agenda, as the Chair said, and I'll request appropriations, Standing Committee Appropriations to remain behind. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. You are, by the way, it's an open meeting. You're free to we've got no secrets to discuss in the committee.
Yes, okay.
So we're not chasing anyone.
All right.
Yeah. Good afternoon, honourable members. Again, let me just check. Darren, are we correcting?
Chairperson?
Yes, Darren?
Yes, Chairperson.
How many are we?
Just double check again. It's 1. Yeah, 8 members, Chair. So we are correcting.
Thank you so much, honourable members. The apologies are the apologies that we had. Honourable Matafa, it's not available. He's attending a funeral, and Honourable Dikhale also not available. Those are the apologies that I had. Hello,
Chairperson. Hello, Chairperson. Honourable Dikhale is here.
So yes. Were you there?
Long time ago, when COSATU was presenting, I was listening.
Okay.
Thank you, Chair.
Welcome. The moral of the story is that you must at least just cough, and then we see you. But welcome, honourable members.
Thank you.
Honourable members, I think there's only one agenda item that we want to discuss. It was presented by National Treasury yesterday. The question of Section 6 of the Adjustment Appropriation Bill. So I don't think we need to go back to that. It was extensively discussed yesterday. But what I did, I just wanted to make sure that with all the considerations and everything which was raised, I just wanted us to check at the legality of it. And I requested Advocate Jenkins just to quickly just confirm that part. Advocate Jenkins.
Chairperson, colleagues, honorable members. Yes, you did ask me. We consulted with it. I also consulted with National Treasury. I do not have legal concerns about the. Remember, it's an amendment we are making to the bill that's been introduced, the Adjustments Appropriation Bill. We're trying to amend that bill so that that bill will then amend the Appropriation Act. Because the Appropriation Act has a provision in it, and Treasury explained it quite well yesterday. The provision in the Act says we can, or the Minister is allowed to spend money up to the point where there's a new Adjustments Appropriation Bill. Now with this second Adjustments Appropriation Bill coming in, an Adjustments Appropriation Bill, which we have this time of the year, it is necessary to sort of redo that provision. So it's basically just redoing that provision to allow the Minister to spend funds that's not being specifically allocated in it. And that expenditure should then be in the next second adjustments budget. I think one must read it, Chairperson, with Section 16 of the Public Finance Management Act as well. I think it's Section 16, which allow the Minister up to a certain point to spend money. But such expenditure must be reported to Parliament, and it must be in a Adjustments Appropriation Bill. So it's all fitting into that sort of financial management of the country. Legally, there's no procedural or problem that we've had with it. In other words, we've put it through the normal legislative process. We had the public hearings today on it. So I don't see any constitutional concerns, whether procedural or substantive. Thank you very much, Chair. I don't know if there are questions. I'm here to answer.
Thank you, honourable members. Not unless there are some questions or clarifications from honourable members, I would like us to proceed. Any questions?
Yes, Chairperson, Dennis Joseph here. Just point of clarity, if you don't mind.
Please,
Yes, thank you. Just want to ask, there was two amounts mentioned by National Treasury, 5 billion and a 7 billion for provisional allocation. I hear what the advocate is saying, but I want just clarity on the, every budget has a contingency reserve. Now, just with clarity, why would there be 5 billion included here for contingency reserve if a normal budget would have it in any case? Just clarity on that. I'm not clear on that part. Thank you.
Advocate, are you there? Yeah, we are muted. You are muted, Advocate.
Sorry, it's maybe a question for National Treasury, but I'm asking the maybe for assistance now. Thank you. Yeah,
yes.
Thank you.
I can only say how I understand it. I don't know the details in it, because obviously you must do, if you're the budget holder, you must do projections to see how big your contingency reserve must be. So that's what I'm thinking happened here. Treasury is probably seeing that they need more contingency reserve because of the fluctuations in expenditure patterns, or they know of certain needs. But as I understand a budget, we do need that contingency reserve item in there for eventualities that we will then spend that money on and then include it in the adjustments budget. But the specific reason why we're adding to it, if I understand your question correctly, Mr. Joseph, is I don't know if they, put it this way, I don't know the rationale why they would want to increase the contingency reserve. I know there must be a contingency reserve. To make it bigger, the specific rationale, the reasons, I will only be speculating if I give you an answer. But it is just procedurally, it's normal to have it there. It should not be too small. It is, I mean, South Africa has been using that time and time again the last few years. So let me stop it there. I'm going to say things which I do not know much about. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Honourable members, Honourable Joseph.
Thank you, Chair. I hear what I think I probably answered my own question. I said I should have asked this question to National Treasury, but yeah, I wanted to know the principle of why there is an addition to constituency budget. Thank you.
Okay, that's fine, honorable members. My main what I requested from Advocate Jenkins was just to look at the legality of what we're having, right? We're busy with. I think that was my main concern, when I checked. So, and I think that's answered. We can get National Treasury to deal with the details of the numbers and so on. I think I'm fine with that. Can we proceed on those bases? Honorable Sarupen, I don't see you. We are hiding. I can only see. I can't even see your eyes.
Check. Can you see me?
No, I don't. I just see the half of it. Just go back.
What's wrong? Let's see. Is this better?
Go down. At least I can see the eyes now. Yeah, that's it.
Okay, better. Okay.
Chairperson,
Yes.
Dennis here. Joseph, besides my question, Honorable Sarupen will represent our view on this particular point 9. Thank you.
That's fine, but before you represent the point, I want to see him. Now he's hiding down. Please go up.
I'm trying. There we go. Is that better?
You are fine. You are perfect now. Don't move.
I will not move.
That's fine. Honorable Sarupen, did you want to say something?
Well, Chair, I'll wait for you to move for the adoption, and then I need to put the party's position forward. So at that point, I need to put the party's position forward.
Perfect.
Before then, Chairperson, may I ask a question for clarity?
Please.
My apologies to all members and you, Chairperson, because I was not in the meeting yesterday. I just want Advocate Jenkins to clarify for me Section 12.7 of the Money Bills and Related Matters Act, so that I have understanding of what the letter was referring to.
Chair, should I procead in answering that?
Yes, please. Please.
Let me just open my act there. My apologies. I must just quickly open my act. I just want to see exactly what I'm talking about. Thank you, Chair, for the indulgence. 12.7. Section 12.7, Chair, speaks to the time period. 15 days after tabling of the National Adjustments Budget, the committee must submit a report on the fiscal framework. Chair, I'm not sure whether that is relevant to it, but what I can do, perhaps it's 17. If we look at, I don't know if Honourable Peters was referring to 17, sub 17 of section 12. Sub 17 is relevant for today's discussion, because subsection 17, stop me if I'm going off script here, Chair, but well, not script, but if I don't answer the question, but 17 specifically refers to what must be in the report, and subsection 18. So, Chair, those.
No. I'm fine. I think the point that you are raising about the 15 days is probably what the period the minister was referring to in the letter, because when I was reading the letter, I got a bit confused by the reference to section 12.7. Now that you talk about the 15 days after the tabling, so it would mean that the request is because the minister is obviating from that. Okay, thank you.
Yes, and if I may add, he probably also taking into consideration time periods. He's not he doesn't need to make further comments on his proposed amendment because he's proposing it. But thank you very much, Chair. Thanks.
I want us to move now. Honorable Kais, I see your hand, but I want us to move towards the adoption and so on, and the DS got a point to make once we have moved adoption. But Honorable Kais?
Yes, I was moving, Chair.
Okay.
Chairperson.
Yes.
Can I ask something?
I'm now.
Yeah, I just want to, before we move for the adoption, I want to ask something from Advocate Jenskins. Are we supposed to adopt this proposal from the minister separate from the report that we are going to write in the bill on its entirety that we are going to do on Tuesday? Is it how we are supposed to do it, to adopt this proposal separately? Because I believe where I stand, it still must feature in that report for Tuesday.
No. Chair, if I may, through you, we deal with this amendment like we would deal with any other amendments to bills. In other words, the amendment has been proposed, so should the committee decide to accept the amendment, that is it. That's the end of it, and we will then refer to it in the report. Usually we will just say, as a committee, we have adopted the bill with amendments and maybe say something about the amendments. But in the case of the Adjustments Appropriation Bill, much like the Appropriation Bill, when we make an amendment, the Money Bills and Related Matters Act is prescriptive. It says what must be in the report. So we have to then deal with it in the report, not separate. We don't have to do a separate report on the amendment. It's all included in the report on the Adjustments Appropriation Bill. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Darren?
Chairperson?
You want to come in?
Yes, I was going to say exactly the same thing that I'm agreeing with Advocate Jenkins. And the other thing is we still need to produce an A bill and a B bill for next week when we are dealing with the report. I don't know if you can remember last year we had a similar process where there were also proposed amendments. So for us to do that, the committee needs to say that they're actually in agreement with the proposals. That way we produce the A and B bill, and then it will also form part of the committee's full report. Yes, Chair. Thank you.
Yeah. So that it's good that Darren came in, because the A and B bill must be worked on from today, so that by the time we do the report, then that's included as part of our report. Hence, we need to adopt it, or reject the inclusion of the amendment today, so that people who are working on the A and the B bills can start working on those bills. Okay. So do we then agree that Kaiso, you do you want to, after this deliberation, are you moving for the adoption?
Yes, Chair. I was moving that this should be included in the report when we draft the report for submission.
So you are moving for the adoption of the amendment?
Yes, I'm moving, Chair, for the adoption of the amendment.
Okay, thank you. Any seconder, Mlenzana, I see your hand is up.
Yes, Chair, my hand was up to actually second Honorable Kaiso.
Thank you. Any counter proposal?
Chair, his hand up.
Honorable Tlangweni.
Honorable Tlangweni.
Thank you, Chair. Chair, can you please raise the objection of the EFF?
Can please note the objection of the EFF. Noted, Honorable Tlangweni. Honorable Sarupen.
Thank you very much, Chair. Hope you can see my face. Yes, I've got enough bandwidth today, so that's a good thing. Chair, just in terms of the position of the Democratic Alliance, it just needs to be minuted that the Democratic Alliance objects to the amendment on the basis that the addition of 7 billion to the contingency reserve without any clear plans or guidelines is quite concerning for the party, and that we are not convinced that this will not be used for South African Airways. And so we would like our objection noted for both myself and Honorable Joseph. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Can I please ask Mr. Sarupen to forward me the reasons for the objections as he explained it now?
I will do so, Chair.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Honorable Mlenzana, I don't want us to open a debate. We're just now voting on this one.
Yes, Chair.
Okay. Can I see your hand? It's up, still up. Okay. That's fine. So, Honorable Peters.
I just want clarity. I didn't get Honorable Sarupen well. Is he saying that he says that we should, as a country, the National Revenue Fund should not have a contingency a reserve allowed for it, but also the fact that it was there in the original February budget, and the fact and it now reflecting in this one. I just want more clarity, because I would understand a situation where it was totally new money that we're talking about, that probably they were concerned about.
Honorable members, Honorable Peters, I hear you, but I don't want to extend this debate. I think you may agree or not agree with the reasons that have been. Honorable Joseph.
Taken.
I'm closing the debate. Honorable Sarupen, you'll forward the reasons to the secretary.
I agree, Chair. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Can I then check who are for the amendment of the bill? Can you help me and count, Darren?
Please. I can only see the two members indicating on the screen, and then
raise your hands on the screen, and then I'll double check after that.
I won't be able to see everybody, Chair. They're gonna have to indicate.
My hand is also up, Dihali. My hand is up.
That's fine. I'll allow you. The note of us. Just a second. Allow me to finish this one. Let's start by names. Who's the first one? For put a name for, and please be on record as to what you are saying. We are voting for. Kaiso, you are voting for. Next, please.
Dihali.
Yes, what are you doing? You're voting for?
Peters.
Peters, Dihali, you are voting for.
Yes, Chair. Yes, Chair.
Yeah, Peters.
I'm voting for.
Yes. Mlenzana is voting for.
Mlenzana is voting for. And does
Chairperson, Mr. Morolong is also in.
Yes.
Mr. Morolong.
Morolong, I'm voting for.
Mr. Morolong, you are voting for. Okay. The chair doesn't need to vote now, does he? For now? No. So there are 5 for and against. Just for the record.
Chair, it's Honorable Sarupen. I'm against.
Honorable Sarupen, you are against.
Honorable Sarupen.
Honorable Tlangwini. Honorable Tlangwini, you are against. I don't hear you. Honorable Joseph, what did you say? You are muted. You are muted. Honorable Joseph, again. Honorable Joseph, I can't hear you. You are muted. You are muted. Okay. Okay. Should I then say we are voting against? If that's just say yes, voting against. Okay. Thank you. So how many for? 5.
Yes, Chairperson. 5 for, 3 against.
Yeah, 5 for and 3 against. Okay, so the decision is carried. The Standing Committee on Appropriations will be amended as suggested. Okay.
The Standing Committee.
Sorry. Let's the appropriations, the Adjustment Appropriations Bill B10 2020 will be amended as suggested. Thanks, Honorable Peters. Okay, that takes care of that item. So, Darren, you may continue with the people who need to do the amendment of the bill, and this will also be contained in the report that we are going to consider next week.
Yes, okay. Chairperson.
When is our next meeting, Darren?
It is on Tuesday, Chairperson, 9 o'clock.
Okay. And you are considering the report?
Yes, Chairperson.
When are you going to have the draft report ready?
I cannot make any promises at this point.
No. I do. Sfiso, I do want, because I like you to send the report to the honorable members before we come to, so that if they've got certain things that they can make those recommendations even before we come to the meeting.
Only what we can say, Chairperson, is that looking at the quantum of work, because we are going to start today drafting the report with Darren, we can only say we will send the report on Monday afternoon. However, if we finish early, there is nothing stopping us from sending the report in. But we can only commit for Monday afternoon, not earlier than that. But if we do it early, you will receive it.
Okay, we are answering like a politician. I don't know a politician.
No,
Okay, honorable members. But thank you very much, honorable members. Thank you, staff, members of the public who might have joined us, members of the media. Thank you very much. The meeting stands adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chair.
And bye-bye.
Chairperson, thank you, Chairperson.
Babalo's still there?
Yes, she's having a snack.
Udlani.
Chairperson, have you noticed the only time when we see Noloyolo is after you concluded the meeting?
Religiously.
It's because she might be doing things that are just inappropriate to flight on the social media platforms.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you.
Bye, guys. Have a good weekend.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chair. Bye.